begin to know the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Well, what is the proper use, the virtuous use of practical reason? Well, to this question, Aristotle thought he detected a general principle common to all virtuous practical behavior. Whatever we do or desire, he says, we can do or desire in different amounts. We can take any human action or emotion and distinguish three amounts on a scale: the too much, the too little, and the just right. The golden mean. Virtuous behavior will always be the golden mean between the two extremes. On the one hand, the too much, the excess as it's called. On the other hand, the too little, the defect as it's called. Now, Aristotle, in a very ingenious way, worked this out on subject after subject, ranging human traits into a threefold column. I'll give you just 4 out of a great many examples. Suppose the question is, what should your attitude be when facing threats? Well, on the one hand, too little fear. Kind of rash person who takes senseless chances. You know, not only walking through a cannibal colony needlessly, but doing so naked. That is the vice of foolhardiness. That's too little fear. On the other hand, there's the other extreme, too much fear, the kind we call a coward. And, of course, in the golden mean position is the virtue, the just right amount, not too little fear, not too much, but just right courage, the courageous person. Or what should your attitude be to food, to sex, to money? Well, the defect would be the person who turns against these things completely, the ascetic. That is a vice. It's as much a vice as rashness or foolhardiness is. Aristotle did not know what to call it because in an extreme form it did not exist in the Greek world, and he calls it insensibility. It became the supreme virtue, or one of them, in the realm of the reign of Christianity. If Aristotle knew of the life of St. Francis, for instance, Aristotle would be appalled at the phenomenon. But now at the other extreme, there's the people who are overzealous about these things. The self-indulgent profligates, a la the sophists, or Gyges when he gets his ring and runs riot. Now what is the proper virtue here? The golden mean. Not too much passion for food, drink, and money, clothes, etc. Not too little, just the right amount, what Aristotle with the Greek tradition calls temperance. And here it does not mean temperance as in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It means a sensible balance between the extremes. What should your attitude be in regard to social relationships? Well, on the one hand, there's the person who attaches too little importance to them, what we would call a misanthrope. Aristotle calls that the vice of sulkiness. On the other hand, there's the kind of person who is obsessed with people, who's obsequious and rushes around saying to everybody, "I love you, please love me," what we would call a social metaphysician. Aristotle says that's the vice of obsequiousness. And in the middle, the golden mean, the just right amount, the rationally friendly person. He has the virtue of friendliness. What should be your attitude to yourself? On the one hand, the person who has too low an estimate. The person who walks around saying, "I'm no good, I'm rotten, I'm worthless." That person has the vice of humility. On the other extreme, there is the person who walks around saying, "I'm the greatest thing that ever lived," who claims for himself more than is his due. That is the vice of vanity or conceit. And the golden mean is the person who has a high and earned self-respect, the virtue of pride.
Horrific event. This is a train collision between a commuter train and a freight train just northwest of Los Angeles near Chatsworth.
Listen to Mr. Thompson's report on the world crisis,
Well,
November
there is more
22nd.
drama on the financial front today. The Fed's considering a new way to pump up what is a very faltering economy, with the government potentially taking ownership stakes in U.S. banks, even some healthy ones.
Cities this morning, we're covering the latest details coming into us about this bridge collapse, and in fact, we have actually
with
obtained
that kind of a prediction, did you hear that? An inflationary depression is coming down the road.
Yes, pirates. Pirates seized a ship last week off.
Listen to Mr. Thompson's report on the world crisis, November 22nd.
This is an NBC News special report. A presidential address.
The President of the United States.
Today, as before, the fate of millions across the world depends upon the unity and resolve of the American people. country has shed more blood for the freedom of other people than all the other countries in the world combined. We are steeped in the tradition of honor and sacrifice for the greater good. We are proud of this heritage. I believe that Americans are once again ready to achieve this greater good. This greater good.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Thompson will not speak to you tonight. His time is up. I have taken it over. You were to hear a report on the world crisis. That is what you are going to hear.
So the U.S. is threatening to veto a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza at the UN Security Council as the U.S. continues to provide political cover for the Israeli massacre of Palestinians. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said in a statement that if the resolution was brought to a vote, it would not be adopted. And this is a resolution that's being drafted by Algeria. So Thomas-Greenfield justified U.S. opposition to a ceasefire by pointing to the U.S. efforts to push for a new hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. But you had Netanyahu last week. He vetoed more hostage talks, and Qatar is saying that the negotiations are not looking good. Qatar's prime minister said that on Saturday. We'll get into that in another story, but Qatar is the mediator of the talks, so they're saying it's not going well. So it's not a good sign. This is just an excuse for the U.S. to veto a ceasefire resolution. Thomas Greenfield said Algeria's resolution would run counter to U.S. efforts on the hostage deal. She said, quote, "We have communicated this concern repeatedly to our colleagues on the council. For that reason, the United States does not support action on this draft resolution. Should it come up for a vote as drafted, it will not be adopted," end quote. So the U.S. has already used its veto power on the Security Council to veto 2 resolutions calling for an end to the onslaught. The Biden administration has also dismissed the International Court of Justice's ruling that it's plausible Israel is committing genocide and continues to provide unconditional support. Of course, as I've been covering, and this is just another example when it comes to the world stage, the U.S. is always going to give backing to Israel, even though the vast majority of the world is against Israel and the U.S. on this. Thomas Greenfield said that the resolution would get in the way of U.S. diplomacy related to pushing for a hostage deal. And now I put diplomacy in quotes there because that's what she called it. The U.S. hasn't really been doing much diplomacy when it comes to Gaza and Israel. She said, quote, "It is critical that other parties give this process the best odds of succeeding rather than push measures that put it and the opportunity for an enduring resolution of hostilities in jeopardy." And it's articles from Middle East Eye. We posted it over the weekend. And it says that the Biden administration is preparing to send arms to Israel, even as it claims to push for a ceasefire in Gaza. And this was according to a report in the Wall Street Journal. And this report said that the U.S. is planning to deliver MK-82 bombs and KMU-572 joint direct attack munitions. And those are basically kits that turn dumb bombs into precision-guided bombs, as well as FMU-139 bomb fuses. The value of the arms is estimated to be in the tens of millions of dollars, according to the report. So it says that the delivery is still being reviewed by Washington, and the details could change as this thing moves forward. So this is just goes to show all the things that they're saying. Oh, we care about civilians in Rafah. We don't want them to go in there without protecting the civilians. But at the same time, they're getting ready to send them more bombs. I mean, it's just all for PR purposes, those claims and these stories about Netanyahu getting so frustrated with, Biden getting so frustrated with Netanyahu. But here they continue to push forward, more arms deliveries. So on Saturday, Ukrainian forces completed a withdrawal from Avdiivka, a key eastern Donetsk city that was central to Ukraine's war effort since the conflict broke out in the Donbass in 2014. So this city was very heavily fortified, and Ukraine, it was a base of operations for Ukraine, not just since 2022 when Russia invaded, but when the Donbass war broke out in 2014. So this is seen as a pretty big loss for Ukraine. And this is the first big victory for Russia since Zelensky sacked Valery Zaluzhny, who was the top general, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, and replaced him with Alexander Syrsky. And Syrsky said in a statement, quote, "Based on the operational situation around Avdiivka, in order to avoid encirclement and preserve the lives and health of servicemen, I decided to withdraw our units from the city and move to defense on more favorable lines," end quote. So this loss, a lot of analysts are saying that this loss could lead to more Russian gains. If Russia keeps up the momentum, they'll be able to push through this area in Donetsk. I believe they're saying they could go to the north because nothing's that heavily fortified. This is a pretty serious defensive line that they broke through. And you have Ukrainian forces facing significant manpower and weapon shortages. And morale is low within the Ukrainian military. We've seen all sorts of reports about just the desperate situation for the people on the front line. And then you have people protesting the conscription or the length of the service that the people who volunteered in the beginning of the war, that they're still on the front lines. So it's not a good situation. And Syrskyi does not have a good reputation among Ukrainian soldiers. He's known as the butcher because he is not afraid to let Ukrainian soldiers be killed. And when he was appointed, there was all these quotes from Ukrainian soldiers, battalion commanders saying, basically, he's going to get us all killed. So it's just a bleak situation. But the U.S. is still trying to fund this war for another year. We'll see if Congress is going to pass that, if the House is going to pass that $95 billion monstrosity that includes $60 billion to keep this war, this death and destruction going.
For 12 years you have been asking, who is John Galt? This is John Galt speaking. I am the man who loves his life. I am the man who does not sacrifice his love or his values. I am the man who has deprived you of victims and thus has destroyed your world. And if you wish to know why you are perishing, you who dread knowledge, I am the man who will now tell you. You have heard it said that this is an age of moral crisis. You have said it yourself, half in fear, half in hope that the words had no meaning. You have cried that man's sins are destroying the world, and you have cursed human nature for its unwillingness to practice the virtues you demand. Since virtue to you consists of sacrifice, you have demanded more sacrifices at every successive disaster. In the name of a return to morality, you have sacrificed all those evils which you held as the cause of your plight. You have sacrificed reason to faith. You have sacrificed wealth to need. You have sacrificed self-esteem to self-denial. You have sacrificed happiness to duty. You have destroyed all that which you held to be evil and achieved all that which you held to be good. Why then do you shrink in horror from the sight of the world around you? That world is not the product of your sins. It is the product and the image of your virtues. It is your moral ideal brought into reality in its full and final perfection. You have fought for it. You have dreamed of it. You have wished it. And I am the man who has granted you your wish.
First letter, which I covered maybe a week and a half ago in an episode, Beware of Tyrants, Anti-Federalist, Federal Farmer #1, he warned against adopting a new system quickly out of fear of an emergency situation, which he said has always been, quote, the custom of tyrants and their dependents. So he's like, hey, let's slow down because it's only the tyrants who want to rush us into a new thing because we're afraid of what might happen if we don't get there. And what do tyrants love more than anything? Well, to most of the founding generation, especially the anti-federalist side, they love power, centralized and consolidated in the fewest hands possible. And in his first paper, again, he did warn that an eventual consolidation wasn't just likely, a centralization. It wasn't going to end up as a federal system, even if it looked like that on paper. He said, overall, it was a plan to make it that way in the long run. He said the plan proposed appears to be partly federal, but principally, however, calculated ultimately to make the states one consolidated government. So he thought that over time, especially terms that were not indefinite, we'll say, led to unlimited indefinite powers because people with power would always try to read things in a way that expanded their own power. And here from T.J. Martinelli said the federal farmer wasn't only concerned about the federal government undermining the states and the power reserved to the states. He worried that it would swallow up the power of the people themselves as well. He kicked off his second letter. The essential parts of a free and good government are a full and equal... Now, maybe such a thing doesn't exist, but we can set that aside. The essential parts of a free and good government are a full and equal representation of the people in the legislature. having the people properly represented was an essential part of the anti-federalist argument. They were saying, well, if you don't actually represent the interests of the people, you only represent small portions of the people, or you don't have enough representatives to properly do that, then it's impossible to have anything other than a consolidated government dictating to the people of the several states. And that's how he kicks off his second argument. Maybe it really came from the federal farmer. Maybe it was a combination of people, but this was a very prominent argument. So he wants to have an equal representation of the people in the legislature, and the jury trial and the vicinage and the administration of justice, a full and equal representation in that which possesses the same interests, feelings, opinions, and views the people themselves would were they all assembled. So the idea, the short version, the TLDR is, you have to have if there's 20% of this type of person and 10% of this type of course, it's not focused on the individual. It's impossible to have everyone represented in a government. And they all recognize that, but they wanted to get as close as possible. And that's what Federal Farmer is getting at here. He said, a fair representation, therefore, should be so regulated that every order of men in the community, according to the common course of elections, can have a share in it in order to allow professionals, merchants, traders, farmers, mechanics, etc., to have a voice in that government. He said, the representation, therefore, must be considerably numerous. It must be very numerous. And he did not like the number of representatives that they were proposing. And this is a very similar take to what the anti-federalist Brutus made in his fourth essay the following month. He made the case that the federal House of Representatives could never be truly representative. It was impossible. It's not possible to represent the people in this type of a situation because there are far too few members. He predicted that this would lead to corruption and bribery. And rather than having a free government, it would lead to one of consolidation, force, and coercion. Therefore, unless the people shall make some great exertions to restore to the state governments their powers in matters of internal police, as the powers to lay and collect exclusively internal taxes, to govern the militia, and to hold the decisions of their own judicial courts upon their own laws final, the balance cannot possibly continue long, but the state governments must be annihilated or continue to exist for no purpose. The short version is he's kind of describing what we live under today because, well, he's really making four main points over what he is concerned with about potential consolidation. And even though, again, it may look like a federal republic on paper, he's taking the position that, well, over time, that power is going to keep growing. And unless we deal with these four things, this is a centralized tyranny. And he said to maintain a federal system rather than that centralized tyranny, you need a few things. One, state-level control over their internal police. So the federal government should have no say, no involvement over local policing. And they have all kinds of that, whether it's through grants or federal court cases or federal programs, joint task forces where local law enforcement, for example, partners with the federal government, the DEA, the ATF, the DOJ, the FBI, all these. There's hundreds of these joint task forces. And in essence, well, not even in essence, technically in law, soon as they partner, soon as a local law enforcement agent partners or is a member of a federal state joint task force, while they are working on that task force, even if they're being paid by the state, they are actually a federal agent and they are not held to the laws of the state. They just have to follow the feds. Now, some people might think, well, okay, great. That means shall not be infringed. But the feds don't actually believe in any of these things. They don't follow any of the Constitution. So when you're working with the feds in many situations, even when the states do something better than what the feds want them to do, they're downgraded when they're working on these state federal task forces. So there's total control in many ways over internal police. So state control over internal policing. There can be no internal taxation from the federal government. And that's obviously been thrown out the window. It was thrown out the window within just a few years. Total control of the states over the militia. Of course, we're trying to see some resurgence in that control with the Defend the Guard Act. And then, of course, the final say of state courts. So if the state courts make a decision about a state law, there is supposed to be no appeal to a federal court to overturn that. Yeah, that gives superiority in the law over the state laws to the federal government. And the federal farmer didn't want any of that. Now,
your ideal had an implacable enemy, which your code of morality was designed to destroy. I have withdrawn that enemy. I have taken it out of your way and out of your reach. I have removed the source of all those evils you were sacrificing one by one. I have ended your battle. I have stopped your motor. I have deprived your world of man's mind. Men do not live by the mind, you say? I have withdrawn those who do. The mind is impotent, you say. I have withdrawn those whose mind isn't. There are values higher than the mind, you say? I have withdrawn those for whom there aren't. While you were dragging to your sacrificial altars the men of justice, of independence, of reason, of wealth, of self-esteem, I beat you to it. I reached them first. I told them the nature of the game you were playing and the nature of that moral code of yours, which they had been too innocently generous to grasp. I showed them the way to live by another morality, mine. It is mine that they chose to follow.
I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
All the men who have vanished, the men you hated, yet dreaded to lose, it is I who have taken them away from you. Do not attempt to find us. We do not choose to be found. Do not cry that you need us. We do not consider need a claim. Do not beg us to return. We are on strike. We, the men of the mind.
A lot of people are saying, well, how dare Putin's government, how dare they seek to jail their political opposition? We would never do that, would we? But there's another aspect to it I think that's very important, and a lot of people have pointed this out, including our good friends over at Zero Hedge. So put up that first clip. Now, this shouldn't be lost on anyone. The airwaves were blown up yesterday all weekend about Navalny's death. And again, we don't know what happened, but nevertheless, here's their headline. Weeks after U.S. journalist dies in Ukrainian custody, Biden uses Navalny's death to push for more Russian war funding. So Aaron Mateev, a friend of ours, excellent investigative journalist, he explains that despite news of Navalny's death in prison, driving world headlines and eliciting remembrances and comments from Western leaders, he was still largely unknown within Russian politics and society. He was a marginal figure in Russia, but nevertheless, he dominated the airwaves. Well, how different it was just a couple of weeks ago when Gonzalo Lira, an American journalist in Ukraine, was tortured and died in a Ukrainian jail. The U.S. said nothing. The administration said nothing. Put on that second clip. It remains that Gonzalo Lira's death on January 24th, following an 8-month imprisonment on charges of justifying Russia's military actions in Ukraine, is not useful to the Biden administration, writes Zero Hedge. Yet Biden, during his speech, was very quick to pivot from Navalny's plight to the need for Congress to push through his funding package for Ukraine. Now, next, I have an interesting chart, and this came out yesterday. They compared the media coverage of the deaths of Gonzalo Lira, an American, versus Navalny. And you look, CNN, 0 mentions of Lira, 16 of Navalny. CBS News, 0 Gonzalo Lira, an American, 17 Navalny. NBC News, 0, 17. Wall Street Journal, 0, 7. So literally the entirety of the mainstream media and the entire political class completely ignored something we actually should have a say about, which is an American getting killed overseas to the people we give so much money to. Totally ignored. But Navalny, we don't know the circumstances, flooded with it.
Well, this whole mess, if we had a proper foreign policy, we would be messed up in the middle of all this. Because the question is about the money, and then who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, and then the people in this country who have to pay the bills, which they don't realize, are being taxed to send out this money, and who gets it? Oh, should we give it more to Russia, or should we give more to the Ukrainians? Oh, Russia's the enemy. That's right. The Cold War is canceled, so we have to do it. But to me, it's still all about the money, and the Congress and all. They have to decide who should get it. The political thing in there. Should we give it to Ukraine, or should we think about protecting our borders? Yeah. That's a big political thing. And actually, there should not be much trouble. But the irony of all this is we don't have any money. We have 0. We're fighting over something we don't have, and yet the people will accept the monopoly money and play these games. And as long as there's a trust in that money, but how can they last trusting a system like this? Or the media is getting into some difficulty, but they're really not. This should destroy mainstream media. So, but that doesn't seem to happen. And I think if people did concentrate on the right thing, you're arguing about who should get the money. Should Ukraine get it, or should we beef up our borders? Well, that shouldn't be too difficult. But even that would be solved if we had a proper policy on the borders.
Our friends over at Responsible Statecraft, who often do some very good work, they commissioned a poll. And it's very interesting. It's not good news for Biden. According to a new poll, nearly 70% of Americans want talks to end the war in Ukraine. Now go to the next one here. This tells you a little bit about it. It says roughly 70% of Americans want the Biden administration to push Ukraine toward negotiated peace with Russia as soon as possible, according to a new Harris poll, Quincy Institute poll. The survey shows a 9-point jump in the poll from late 2022. In that poll, 57, so still a majority, said they want it. But now 7 out of 10 respondents to the poll say, Biden, you need to push Ukraine into talks to end this war.
Good luck, huh?
Yeah.
But if we weren't there, it would happen.
Yeah.
I mean, how did they get into this mess?
Yeah.
It's because, well, it was because of our policy in NATO. But that's still very unpopular to say that in this country. You're unpatriotic if you said we participated and NATO participated in precipitating this crisis.
Many politicians and officials used the moment to press that Ukraine would lose the war without the $60 billion more in U.S. military aid currently awaiting a vote in the House. But they also sounded far from certain about what a victory might look like for Ukraine, even with the boost. Now go to the next one. Here's another clip. Many sidestepped the question of what a Ukrainian victory would look like or when it might happen. Senator Mark Warner, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, said the aid package would be a game changer for Ukraine, but he declined to say that the support would ensure a Ukrainian triumph, simply stating that American assistance was Kiev's last best hope. So even the biggest cheerleaders for this money, Dr. Paul, have no idea and in fact are skeptical that it's going to do anything. So tell that to the taxpayer.
See, the way I understand that, it won't make any change in that area, but there will be consequences, and there will be changes. I think the American power that they depend on with the empire is going to be diminished. It already is. And also that our national security is going to be, more threatened. So there will be changes. There's always a cost, and they work very, very hard. And people who have a lot of control, more power than just money, but if they have the power, they do get the money, and they'll do. If they fighting for it, they know there's a little contest. We have to do this and this. It's sort of a big game. But once they're there, boy, they don't want to lose a penny, and they will do anything to maintain that position.
Our strike consists not of making demands, but of granting. We are evil, according to your morality. We have chosen not to harm you any longer. We are useless, according to your economics. We have chosen not to exploit you any longer. We are dangerous and to be shackled, according to your politics. We have chosen not to endanger you, nor to wear the shackles any longer. We have no demands to present to you. You have nothing to offer us. We do not need you. Are you now crying, no, this was not what you wanted? A mindless world of ruins was not your goal? You did not want us to leave you? You moral cannibals. Through centuries of scourges and disasters, brought about by your code of morality, you have cried that your code had been broken, that the scourges were punishment for breaking, that men were too weak and too selfish to spill all the blood it required. You damned man. You damned existence. You damned this earth, but never dared to question your code. You went on crying that your code was noble, but human nature was not good enough to practice it. And no one rose to ask the question, good? By what standard? I am the man who has asked that question. Yes, this is an age of moral crisis. Yes, you are bearing punishment for your evil. But it is not man who is now on trial. And it is not human nature that will take the blame. It is your moral code that's through this time. Your moral code has reached its climax, the blind alley at the end of its course. And if you wish to go on living, what you now need is not to return to morality, but to discover it.
Now I must leave the golden mean for a couple of minutes, because pride for Aristotle is the crown of the virtues. The man of pride, the man of megalopsyche, the man with a big soul, which is now translated the magnanimous man, is his ideal man in terms of the moral virtues. And his description of it in the Ethics is the liveliest passage in his Ethics, very famous, so I must read it to you, even though I'll give you just a few excerpts, but it'll give you an idea of the type of man Aristotle admired and recommended. He's describing the virtue of pride. Quote, "Now the man is thought to be proud who thinks himself worthy of great things, being worthy of them. For he who does so beyond his deserts is a fool, but no virtuous man is foolish. The proud man then is the man we have described. For he who is worthy of little and thinks himself worthy of little is temperate but not proud. For pride implies greatness, as beauty implies a good-sized body. And little people may be neat and well-proportioned, but cannot be beautiful. The proud man, then, is an extreme in respect of the greatness of his claims, but a mean in respect of the rightness of them. For he claims what is in accordance with his merits, while the others go to excess or fall short. Now, the proud man, since he deserves most, must be good in the highest degree. For the better man always deserves more, and the best man most. Therefore, the truly proud man must be good. And greatness in every virtue would seem to be characteristic of a proud man. And it would be most unbecoming for a proud man to fly from danger, swinging his arms by his sides, or to wrong another. If we consider him point by point, we shall see the utter absurdity of a proud man who is not good. Nor again would he be worthy of honor if he were bad. For honor is the prize of virtue, and it is to the good that it is rendered. Pride then seems to be a sort of crown of the virtues, for it makes them greater, and it is not found without them. Therefore it is hard to be truly proud, for it is impossible without nobility and goodness of character. It is chiefly with honors and dishonors, then, that the proud man is concerned. And at honors that are great and conferred by good men, he will be moderately pleased, thinking that he is coming by his own, or even less than his own. For there can be no honor that is worthy of perfect virtue, yet he will at any rate accept it, since they have nothing greater to bestow on him. But honor from casual people and on trifling grounds he will utterly despise, since it is not this that he deserves, and dishonor too, since in his case it cannot be just. The proud man does not run into trifling dangers, nor is he fond of danger, because he honors few things. But he will face great dangers, and when he is in danger, he is unsparing of his life, knowing that there are conditions on which life is not worth having. I interject so much for Aristotle's view on the question of better read than dead. Continuing the quote, and the proud man is the sort of man to confer benefits, but he is ashamed of receiving them, for the one is the mark of a superior, the other of an inferior. It is a mark of the proud man also to ask for nothing or scarcely anything, but to give help readily, and to be dignified towards people who enjoy high position and good fortune, but unassuming towards those of the middle class. For it is a difficult and lofty thing to be superior to the former, but easy to be so to the latter. And a lofty bearing over the former is no mark of ill breeding, but among humble people it is as vulgar as a display of strength against the weak. Again, it is characteristic of the proud man not to aim at the things commonly held in honor, or the things in which others excel, to be sluggish and to hold back except where great honor or a great work is at stake, and to be a man of few deeds, but of great and notable ones. He must also be open in his hate and in his love, for to conceal one's feelings, i.e. to care less for truth than for what people will think, is a coward's part. And he must speak and act openly, for he is free of speech because he is contemptuous, and he is given to telling the truth except when he speaks in irony to the vulgar. He must be unable to make his life revolve around another, unless it be a friend. For this is slavish, and for this reason all flatterers are servile, and people lacking in self-respect are flatterers. Further, a slow step is thought proper to the proud man, a deep voice, and a level utterance. Such then is the proud man. The man who falls short of him is unduly humble. Unquote. Now, if you consider this in the light of what was to come philosophically, the man who falls short of this is unduly humble. You can't believe it. This is one of the few man-worshipping passages in all of philosophy, and it is fitting that it comes from Aristotle, who has, needless to say, been despised by centuries of Christians for this very passage and this very quality. And this, I should say, is one of the great kinships between Aristotle and objectivism. All right, so much for pride. Let's go back to the golden mean.
Protect the First Amendment. Impeach Joe Biden. Protecting democracy and the Constitution from Donald Trump and the MAGA extremists is a major theme of President Biden's re-election campaign. As is often the case in American politics, President Biden is just as, if not more, guilty of posing an existential threat to the Constitution as those he smears as extremists. For example, President Biden and members of his administration have waged a campaign to undermine the First Amendment by encouraging companies to suppress the expression of unapproved views online. The latest example of the administration trying to get a private internet company to censor Americans may be the most outrageous of all. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan recently released a series of emails between Biden administration officials and Amazon, the world's largest online retailer. The government officials wanted Amazon to remove from its online catalog books containing misinformation regarding the safety and effectiveness of COVID vaccines. meaning anything questioning the government's pro-vaccine propaganda. While Amazon did try to push back some against the administration, it did remove at least one anti-vaccine book from its online category. Amazon also manipulated its search results to make sure books expressing skepticism of the vaccines were buried under books touting the pro-vaccine line. The company probably hoped that by burying these dissident books, Amazon could make the administration happy without actually removing all books that question the COVID vaccines. The company also promised the administration that it would expand use of a Centers for Disease Control warning for books promoting anti-vaccine narratives. Some libertarians say that Amazon should not be criticized for its decisions. These libertarians point out that as a private company, Amazon has the right to decide what books to sell and also has the right to decide to make it difficult to find books expressing viewpoints the company finds dangerous or distasteful. This is true, but ignores one important fact. Amazon's decision to suppress books critical of COVID vaccines was not done to attract consumers who would not shop at a site that sells anti-vaccine propaganda or conspiracy theories. Instead, Amazon acted at the behest of government officials who were seeking to prohibit Americans from accessing alternative views. Amazon may have been eager to cooperate with the government to avoid being subjected to antitrust litigation. At the very time the administration was demanding Amazon suppress COVID dissidents, President Biden was preparing to appoint Lena Khan, an advocate for antitrust legislation against Amazon, to lead the Federal Trade Commission. It is clear that the U.S. government has been a major spreader of COVID disinformation, while those challenging the government's pro-mask, pro-vax, and pro-lockdown propaganda have been the main truth tellers. COVID is an example of why protecting the First Amendment is vital to protecting not just liberty, but also our prosperity and health. Congress should prioritize its investigation into the Biden administration's efforts to silence Americans because of their views. Congress should then impeach all high-level federal officials, including President Biden, who took action to violate Americans' First Amendment rights. Thanks for listening.
So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday boasted that he had worked for decades to block the establishment of a Palestinian state. Netanyahu said, quote, "Everyone knows that I am the one who, for decades, blocked the establishment of a Palestinian state that would endanger our existence," end quote. And so this is something we've heard commonly from Netanyahu now recently. And, you know, it's always a big talking point that it's all the Palestinians' fault that there was never a two-state solution. But here you have Netanyahu now constantly saying that he worked to prevent a Palestinian state and that he's going to continue to do so. And he made these comments while discussing a plan to introduce legislation into the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that would match a declaration made by the Israeli cabinet on Sunday that rejected international diktats related to a Palestinian state. So I covered that yesterday. That was approved unanimously by the Israeli cabinet. And these statements came after reports that said the U.S. and some of its Arab partners were looking to unveil an outline for a long-term peace deal that would include a firm timeline toward a Palestinian state. Netanyahu said that Israel is facing, quote, "an attempt to force upon us the unilateral establishment of a Palestinian state, which will endanger the existence of the state of Israel," end quote. He said the Knesset legislation will, quote, "show the world that there is wide agreement in Israel against the international efforts to force on us a Palestinian state," end quote. So a visit from an Iranian general to the Shia militias in Iraq led to a pause in attacks on U.S. forces. And this was reported by Reuters on Sunday. And the report cited Iranian and Iraqi sources. And we saw other reports and indications that Iran was telling them to stop. And this was on January 29th, which was one day after 3 U.S. troops were killed at Tower 22 at that base in Jordan on the Syrian border. Brigadier General Esmail Khani made the trip, and he is the commander of the Iranian Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And so he warned that the death of the American soldiers would likely provoke a heavy American response and said the groups should lie low to avoid being targeted. A day after the visit, if you remember, Kateb Hezbollah, one of the most powerful Shia militias in Iraq, announced that it was suspending attacks on U.S. troops. In its statement, Kateb Hezbollah said that Iran, quote, repeatedly declared opposition to our escalation against the U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, end quote. Initially, one faction did not agree to the Iranian request, and there were a few more attacks on U.S. bases, but there have been none since February 4th, which was the day 6 U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters were killed in a drone attack on a U.S. facility in Syria. So there's been none since February 4th. So that is significant because the attacks were happening just about every day since October. So there's been a calm. And I think besides the visit from the Iranian general, the Iranian pressure, the Iraqi government also seems to be stepping up its efforts to get the U.S. to withdraw, making a very public, their desire, and they did restart talks. So that might have something to do with this because that's a big goal of Kateb Hezbollah and the other Shia militias, which are part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, which is part of the Iraqi security forces. They're part of Iraq's military. This is part of the reason why the Iraqi government was so angry about these U.S. airstrikes that they kept launching. So at least this one area has calmed down because this is definitely there's still a risk. There's still a major, just the U.S. presence in Iraq, the occupation of Syria. It's just such a big tripwire for a bigger war. The hearing for Julian Assange, his appeal hearing to fight his extradition to the U.S. begins today, and it will be held on Wednesday as well. And this is likely his final chance to appeal the UK decision to extradite him to the U.S., where he will stand trial for exposing U.S. war crimes. And all he did was publish documents that he obtained from a source. That's what journalists do, very standard practice. So if he's extradited and convicted, very grave implications for the First Amendment. It essentially would mean that the government could convict anybody using the Espionage Act that they want who's putting out information that they don't like. That's what it can mean. So Stella Assange, who is Julian Assange's wife, has been warning that, due to his weak mental and physical state, just the ordeal of this case, that she fears he will die if he's extradited to the U.S. And Assange's lawyer is saying the same thing. So Stella Assange told BBC that the stress from the case has left her husband in a very difficult place. She said, quote, this case will determine if he lives or dies, essentially, end quote. So Julian Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, has also warned that he could die if extradited due to his mental condition after being held in London's Belmarsh prison for over 4 years and the 7 years that he spent under asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy. She said, quote, because of the treatment he has suffered, he suffers a major depressive illness. He has been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, and the medical evidence is if he was extradited to the U.S., those conditions would cause him to commit suicide. So his life is at risk, and I am not exaggerating that, end quote. And the initial decision by the UK court was that he shouldn't be extradited to the U.S. because of the conditions of U.S. prisons are too harsh, and so the implication of that was that he could die, he might commit suicide or something in American prisons. The U.S. appealed that decision, and then they ruled to extradite him, and now this is Assange's appeal. So this is a really big deal. It's really important, this case, and there's been more pressure from the Australian government, from the Prime Minister, and the one thing that WikiLeaks and Assange supporters want Americans to do, just to put pressure on Congress right now to oppose the extradition, is there is a bill in the House that was introduced by Representative Paul Gosar, who's a Republican from Arizona, and basically it's just a bill that says the U.S. should drop the charges, regular journalistic activities are protected under the First Amendment. The United States should drop all charges against Julian Assange. So you could call your House representative and tell them to support this bill, say that it's important for First Amendment and press freedom in this country.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Well, I like that the New York City court system decided, hey, you can't make banks money. We have to bail them out. If they're looking at the economics, the way that banks are supposed to work, and you're not allowed to make the money. And then I listened to the prosecutor. She made a speech afterwards, and she said, this is not a victimless crime because it takes resources from other people. And I would love to hear the economics on how making money for a bank somehow takes away resources from other people. What individual walked into Deutsche Bank and didn't get a loan on behalf of them making a loan to Donald Trump that was making them money? Can you possibly explain to me who this individual is? Firstly, you don't have access to the same capital that Donald Trump is. You're not seeing the same loan officers. But the fact that you could pass a $400 million judgment off the basis that this somehow creates harm for people and that it removes resources from them, can you explain that theory to me? Where's the economist behind that one? Just explain it.
Yeah, and Donald Trump's whole defense in this was that there were no victims. And typically, in a civil case, you can't just say, well, no, there are other theoretic victims who aren't involved in this case.
It's a little bit worse.
You have to actually point to the victims. So just to be clear, so everybody understands, this was not an instance in like a civil case. I think what most people think of is like some Judge Judy shit or something like that, or like obviously that's a lower level of it, but like where it's like, you know, when you watch Judge Judy, she's never deciding whether someone's going to jail or not. She's deciding who owes the other one $300. But now people also think of like higher level civil cases where like, okay, they couldn't get OJ on the criminal case, but they could sue him civilly and then get him that way. But with all of these cases, you in your mind already, you have a victim who's suing somebody for doing something to them. But in this case, no victim is presented, but the government is coming in and saying, no, there is a victim here. And who is the victim? I don't know. They can't point to them, but they could theoretically say that, again, they're not claiming that he lost the bank money. They're claiming that if he valued his properties more accurately, he would have made them more money. And because he didn't make them more money, therefore they didn't have more money that they could have given out to a hypothetical victim. It just, the whole thing makes absolutely no sense. It's like everything with these legal charges, these ridiculous novel theories. And like, what's so funny about it is you're like, the guy was president of the United States of America. He backed the Saudis in a war of genocide. You know, you could charge him for that. Like, there's crimes here. But of course, they won't do that because that would implicate like all of the presidents, including Barack Obama and Joe Biden, who also backed the Saudis in a war of genocide. And Joe Biden is now backing Israel in a war of debatably genocide, I guess. But like, they can't charge him for any of that. So they're just coming up with this bullshit. And it's just so obvious. It's so obvious that this is only being done because there is such intense hatred for this guy. And there's a plan to not allow him a fair shot at running.
There's another element to this, which at least I think is funny, is that every time Donald Trump gave a document to the bank, it basically says on the bottom, and for all intended purposes, these documents are complete horseshit and you have to go do your own research. And guess what? Banks have all the resources in the world to research and decide whether or not they want to process your loan. That's the business that they're in. And if they choose to process your loan and they bet right and made money, how do you possibly insert yourself into that and go, what you did here? And by the way, the fraud's not even by him. It would be by whoever prepared the documents for him. Somebody actually prepares the documents, and the documents literally say on the bottom, hey, trust none of this, do your own homework. And the banks, they did their own homework and made money.
The other thing about it that's just hard to not recognize is just that, you know, look, like, I mean, this is nothing new that we haven't said before, but there is our country is changing at such a rapid rate that it's kind of hard to keep up with. It's much easier when you kind of zoom out. It's much easier to look at, you know, 30 years ago or something like that, and to go like, wow, we live in a drastically different country than we did in the 1990s, you know? But just over the last 4 years, our country has changed very dramatically. And it does seem like this is a precedent for something different. And I'm certainly not someone who is saying like America was perfect and we didn't have our problems before this. But this is something where like if you are like kind of hated, and this is more true than ever where we're so like polarized, and particularly on political tribal grounds. And now it seems like the standard is almost like if you are hated politically, the justice system can be weaponized against you and you will not be able to get a fair trial. You know, that was the kind of the truth with that kid who's looking at jail time for that tweet that he sent about texting a vote to Hillary Clinton. And this is just man, is it not a good sign? But imagine, you know, just like try to, you know, we talk about this all the time, but you're like, you got to really try to think about what we're talking about here. The former president of the United States of America, who's also the front runner to be the next president of the United States of America, is not being taken out by some negative ad campaign. You know what I mean? Like, he's not being taken out by like, you know, big donors funding his opponent. He's being taken out by this obvious, I mean, what is so obvious, this mass attempt at every level to charge him with anything that you can twist yourself into pretzels to throw at the wall and charge him with. And then try him in these areas with biased district attorneys, biased judges, and biased juries.
And well, the fun part of it is they get to create their own evidence of now they get to run their campaign ads of the criminal who's been barred from doing business in New York State, or maybe it's just New York City, involved in 5 criminal court cases.
this guy and his group, they go back to SNCC in the 60s, and he founded this group in the early 70s, and they've been internationalists, black communists, of exactly how you categorize them, this whole time, longer than I've been alive. And man, I got a lot of white hair in my beard here. So the idea that, and so what, they ran for an election. They go, oh, you're interfering in the election on behalf of Russia. And now when you complain about being black in America and thinking that you're being treated unfairly, now you're sowing discord on behalf of Russia. Now, I got to tell you, I mean, as a line of crap, that's fine on MSNBC, and I'm sure all the white liberal women who watch that believe it. But they're going to try to make that stick in court against a guy?
Right.
That the same speech he's been given for 50 years is now sowing discord on behalf of a foreign power because he got $7,000 from a Russian national who, it's not even in evidence, is a spy of any kind. If they say he's tied to the Kremlin, that means they're not saying he's tied to the FSB. He's not tied to the GRU. Oh, he's he knows a political officer up there somewhere or something, and that's what they're going to hang on this guy? Is it as nuts as I think? Because I'm no lawyer. I don't know. But that's what it sounds like you're telling me here.
It is that nuts. And I mean, the fact is, if we lose this motion, I don't see how they could possibly prove this case, because you're raising a lot of very, very good points. But it's a legal matter. To get a case dismissed at this stage, to get an indictment dismissed, you basically have to argue that the allegations are false. These guys are not Russian agents. It's absurd. They can't prove that at trial. But if it were true, it still would violate the Constitution to go forward with this prosecution. So for a motion to dismiss, you have to assuming that the allegations in the complaint are true, it still is an unconstitutional prosecution and a dangerous prosecution. So yes, it clearly is an absurdity of Russiagate to try to get people to believe that these people are acting on behalf of Russia. And when you say sowing discord, that's right in the indictment. I think they use the word dissidents or something. But that's what activists do, right? I mean, Vietnam War activists were sowing discord in the United States. You make people think about their government and question their leaders and question, why are we in Vietnam? What is it? Are we being told the truth about the progress of the war? Are we being told the truth about why we're there? Are we being told the truth about the reasons we went there? And, that's sowing discord. If
you trip out and think about it, that's a pretty broad term, isn't it? Discord.
It sure is.
Who says there's anything negative about that at all, in fact?
I mean, if you're a good activist, isn't that your goal, to get people to think and question? I mean, if you're not causing some sort of discord, then you're probably not doing your job as an activist.
Yeah, seriously. Well, and especially if you're a black internationalist, revolutionary communist type, then it would seem like that's kind of part of the program. Right. And that's been legal for a long time. Just look at the Biden White House. They got it going on. Okay, that was a joke. It wasn't that funny. But they are kind of commie. But,
And just to correct one thing.
Sure.
These people I don't think they don't identify as communists. They're socialists.
Okay.
So
thank you for that correction. I should just call them what they call themselves. It's fine, because Red Star or whatever, they're, they have their position, and it's people can hear them explain it in their own words, not mine.
You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to disagree with them.
Yeah.
It's about pure free speech, because you take away their.
I mean, it's almost even more to the point if they were like outright anti-American, revolutionary, commie, whatever, because even more to the point, we still got to protect them, right? Like, even if they're Nazis, even if they're
that's true, that's
whatever
true.
insane politics they might have, if their rights aren't protected, then none of ours are. And of course, like you're talking about, the dissident case on Ukraine is the truth. The government is wrong and is doing the wrong thing based on a bunch of lies. Everybody knows that. So I think that's kind of important for the story too, isn't it? That Mearsheimer and Sachs that you quote, they're right.
Right. And I think people are starting to, I think the tide is turning, and I think people are starting to realize that they've been misled, since 2022. I mean, it's kind of shocking. You look at the New York Times, and they don't even, when they talk about the Ukraine war, it's an unprovoked invasion in February of 2022. They don't even talk about the background. No, they don't try to educate their readers about the context of this war. And that's what these guys are doing. And I think the reason why, you're right. I mean, you can, under the First Amendment, advocate in theory, the overthrow of the U.S., I suppose. But that is sort of a fine line, because that's how they got around some of the only bad Supreme Court cases that on free speech use sort of the communist threat. And they talk about hearings in Congress and findings in Congress that the Communist Party has at its core the violent overthrow of the United States. And that's sort of how they got around how some of the bad rulings came out, saying that if you are a communist or if you're supporting the communist ideology, that could create a national security threat. So even if we go there, these guys don't do that. There's no question. They're not advocating for the overthrow of the United States government. They're not advocating for violence. Their rallies are peaceful. So this is really a very stark. I think that's why it's going to be very difficult for the district court judge to sign off on this, to say that, yeah, these people are so dangerous in basically having a political opinion about a war that's different from what the Biden administration opinion is. So I think that's what gives me hope that this case won't proceed to trial. And, the Supreme Court has also been clear that just letting this case stand, having it pending, is quite dangerous for free speech. There's cases, I think the Dombrowski case basically makes this point very well, that says just having the case pending is a message to other activists that you better watch what you say, because your home could be raided and you could be on trial in federal court and have to hire lawyers. And so I think that's why this motion to dismiss is so important. Even though I'm confident that we're going to beat this case if it goes to trial in front of a jury, I still think it sets a really dangerous precedent to let it go forward.
Yeah.
Of course, we sure wish you could help our friend Assange a little bit more than so far anybody has been able to do.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of people hoping and praying and working for him. But what a tragedy. But there's some more hearings going on, and some claim this is it for him. He's on a ship to a dungeon in America someplace.
God hope not.
I doubt if they'll give him a hotel room.
No.
The hotel rooms are full anyway. The illegals are in here. So, but anyway, I think most people on our station have heard us talk about Assange, and this has been a tragedy going on 10 years or so. And he keeps getting, with the officials into a deeper hole. And it is said that this week there are some hearings going on again, maybe, and some claim it could be the final hearings before he gets sent to, the United States. And of course, there's a new thing that turned up this weekend that caught our attention. It tells you and indicates the typical type of people who are doing that. Well, maybe we have a good judge.
Yeah.
If we have a good judge, what the heck? A judge can do a lot to restore the principles of freedom and following the rules. But here it says Assange judge worked for MI6 and the Defense Administration. And this is the British, I assume, because that's where they've held him. So the Brits aren't, I sort of look at them as a minor state. That they just go along with whatever we tell them to do, and they do a lot, but they still have a lot of influence. So this is going to be a big deal.
U.S. Justice Department must drop spy charges against Julian Assange. And today and tomorrow are those hearings, and as you point out, the judge in these hearings, the sub-judge, does have some ties to what we would call the global deep state. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he's not capable of making an objective choice, but it is somewhat worrisome. Our good friend Thomas Massie and Representative Jim McGovern put out a letter to their colleagues. If you can put this next one up, very good letter. It had a lot of bipartisan support. Apologies for this being pretty small, but it's just urging President Biden to drop the charges against Assange. It makes the point that across the world, mainstream media, alternative media, members of the House of Representatives have all urged the end of the persecution of Assange because what he's doing is journalism. And you go to the next page, you can see that it's a very bipartisan. This is only some of the names that have signed it, but I think Senator Paul is on it. But when you have Thomas Massie, Paul Gosar, and Ilhan Omar, and Ilana Pressy, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's a pretty good group of people across the board who are trying to get Assange, get the charges dropped. The idea that, what Assange, as we've said so many times, Dr. Paul, he simply published information that someone leaked him, which is no different than what the New York Times does, Washington Post with the Pentagon Papers. They do this all the time and they've never been. But they also realize that there's a threat that if Assange can be put in prison for 175 years for publishing leaked classified documents, then they can hear the footsteps coming for them. And I think that's why. It's not that the New York Times has suddenly, gotten religion, but they realize that this could come for them. So it really is a dangerous situation for Assange. Look at this, if we can put it on there. The outrageous part of the UK's years-long trial to condemn Julian Assange to die in an American dungeon is that the victim of his quote-unquote crime, i.e. journalism, is a state rather than a person. It's a definition of a political offense which the U.S.-UK extradition treaty explicitly forbids. And that is a great point. The victim, quote unquote, is the state, not an individual. So that means by definition, this is a political crime. They can't extradite for a political crime.
Unless they get away with it.
Yeah, unless they get away with it.
So that's what we don't want them to do, because other than that, there will be no rule of law. And that's on the table right now for what's going to happen in the future, because, you know, you think about the elections that have gone on, a lot of controversy, a lot of evidence, and yet it was said that Trump was evil. Trump did everything. And it turned out that the opposition was doing what they accused him of. So it's bad news, but I still believe in documentation. And I think the most important thing is that people retain their credibility, because the good people like Snowden. Snowden, look at what he's been through. He could have been thrown in a dungeon and forgotten about it, but fortunately he was able to maneuver. So so he's I bet he's one of the most listened to journalists right now ever.
And he can't even come back to his own country.
Yeah,
though, you know?
That's what he had to give up.
Can't come home. Well, one more I just wanted to put up. I know we need to move on to our other topic, but this is a really good point, I think, and this is put out by Declassified UK. Now, the article said CIA officials under Trump discussed assassinating Julian Assange, and that's a news article. Classified UK commented on this, saying, "This week, the UK High Court will decide whether to extradite Julian Assange to a country which spied on his privileged legal conversations and plotted to kidnap or kill him. The independence of the UK judiciary is on trial." Yeah, that's pretty interesting. We remember what Pompeo was trying to plot to kill Assange, and now the UK is going to send him to the country that plotted to kill a guy from doing journalism.
I'd like to have somebody do a poll as objectively as possible and ask people, not only the ones that listen to our program, but be as objective as they can possibly be, and say, can you trust the CIA if you'd happen to run a mess with him and run into them? And I don't think there'd be an overwhelming number of Americans that say, "Oh, I trust them. I trust them." Right now, the FBI in the last year or two, there was finally some more exposure by the FBI. But we were always taught for so long, and I came of age when I was in college, that the FBI was to be respected. And there were some conservatives that were in the FBI that I knew personally, and there was an assumption that I liked them and I trusted them. But I don't think that exists. And then if you got a little bit of history of J. Edgar Hoover, maybe you would wake up and say, maybe it didn't even start off well.
Now, if you recall the 4 examples I gave you, the moral that Aristotle draws is, it's not what you do or desire, but the degree to which you do it that determines virtue and vice. Virtue is an issue of moderation, of not going to extremes. Now, you can see, I think, that there is a common sense validity, and in certain points even a highly admirable quality in the content of the virtues Aristotle endorses. And I've just given a few samples. The particular virtues that he's in favor of are generally sensible and even noble. But as a principle of ethics, it should be apparent to you that the golden mean is unsatisfactory and invalid. Here are a few obvious objections. First, notice that the trinity of attitudes which Aristotle ranges on a continuum do not, in fact, fall on a continuum at all. The vices in each case are differentiated from the virtues in kind, not just in degree, as Aristotle's doctrine requires. The obsequious social metaphysician, for instance, is not differentiated from a rationally friendly person by just having more of the latter's attitude. The obsequious person's motive and interest in people is different in kind, not just in degree or amount, and the same is true on all these other cases. Notice, secondly, if it were just a difference in degree, there'd be no argument in favor of the mean. There is no reason why a mean is valid just because it's a mean. The mere fact that some attitude is in the middle between 2 other attitudes doesn't at all show that it's therefore desirable. For instance, on one extreme we have never committing adultery. On the other extreme we have committing adultery every night with a different partner. Now, is the golden mean just the right amount? Just the right amount of murder? Just the right amount of envious hatred, etc.? Now, here, obviously, your place on a continuum is irrelevant. Now, Aristotle tries to encompass this type of case. And he says, in effect, these things, like murder, adultery, and so on, are already extremes. And therefore, the doctrine of the mean doesn't apply. You can't have a mean of an extreme. But this is not a valid answer on his part. Because the question is, how does he know they are extremes? If you go solely by the doctrine of the mean, we can range 3 attitudes. on murder or on adultery, etc., and then pick the middle. Actually, the fact is Aristotle knew in advance that murder, for instance, is wrong, and he therefore classified it as an extreme. It's not that it's an extreme and therefore wrong, but rather it's wrong and therefore he concluded an extreme, which means that his virtues are not in fact derived from the theory of the mean at all, rather from, as he himself says, the observations of the wise Athenians. The mean doctrine is no proof or definition of these virtues, just a way of expounding what we know on other grounds, and as such is philosophically insignificant. And then, of course, there is the question, how do you know what the mean is in a particular case? Suppose one person says never eat chocolates, and the other, a chocolate manufacturer, says eat 200 boxes a day. Well, what is the golden mean, 100 boxes a day? Now, Aristotle considers such a case, and he says, no, I don't mean the arithmetic mean. I don't mean the exact halfway point, that would be silly. I mean the just right amount for a given person. The not too much and the not too little. And this varies from person to person. For instance, on chocolates, it depends on your health, your taste, your money, etc. The just right amount if you're on a diet is not the same as if you're not. The mean, he says, is relative to a particular set of circumstances. It's not figured out by arithmetic. But then, of course, the question is, well, how do you know, given a set of circumstances, what is the mean? And you have to know if the doctrine is to be of any use to you in guiding your life. Well, Aristotle says, in effect, if you take into account all the relevant factors in a given situation, and if you're well brought up, you will just know. You will, in effect, perceive what the right amount is for you by direct insight. Now then, of course, the question is, well, what does being well brought up consist of? To be well brought up, presumably, is to be brought up via the golden mean. And the mean is what a well brought up person would choose. So you see, it's inexorably circular. And you see, again, he doesn't offer a scientific ethics. It's based ultimately simply upon his observations of the wise and good Athenians. Well, I don't want to belabor the mean doctrine further. It's had very unfortunate consequences. It's, although I should say, for Aristotle's own sake, that he didn't originate the idea of moderation by any means. That was an ancient Greek tradition. Nothing in excess goes way back before Aristotle, and all he did is systematize it. But in any event, that particular Greek doctrine, although given Aristotle's influence, has had terrifically unfortunate consequences. It's led people to all sorts of compromising, fence-sitting, contradictions and evasion on principle, even though none of this was Aristotle's intention. You need merely think of the way the terms moderate and extremist are thrown around in American presidential elections to get an idea of the devastatingly bad consequences of the doctrine of the golden mean, even though, as I say, Aristotle would surely never have imagined its use by modern pragmatists.
So Israel is demolishing buildings to build a road through central Gaza that will cut the strip in two, demonstrating Israel's long-term plans to occupy the territory. So Israel's Channel 14 reported on this road, which is being built in an area known as the Net Zarim Corridor. And this new road, known as Highway 749, will separate Gaza City from the rest of the strip. Israel is creating a 1 kilometer buffer zone to the north and to the south of the road. So it's going to be 2 kilometers wide. Which is similar to this zone that they're also creating along the entire Israel-Gaza border. That's 1 kilometer inside of Gaza from the Israeli border. They're demolishing everything that's there, including the agricultural land, and just basically turning it into a militarized area that Israel can control. And now this is the same that they're doing here, going across the Gaza Strip. And among the structures that need to be demolished for them to complete this road and this buffer area is the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital, which was shut down in November due to an Israeli siege that cut off fuel. So they might be demolishing a hospital in Gaza. And this was Gaza's only cancer hospital that shut down. It was very early on. It was like November 1st or 2nd that they said they had to shut it down. And the construction will also require the demolition of Al-Aqsa University, several villages, amusement parks, and agricultural land. Israeli soldiers said that the purpose of the road was to make it easier to launch incursions into other parts of Gaza, and it could also prevent the movement of Palestinians from the south to the north. The Wall Street Journal also reported on this highway and said that it would effectively create a militarized belt across Gaza that will help prevent the 1 million Palestinians who fled the north from returning to their homes. So that's how the Wall Street Journal reported this. President Biden on Tuesday said his administration would be announcing major sanctions on Russia over the death of Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny. Biden told reporters before boarding Marine One on Tuesday, quote, What I came to tell you was we'd be announcing sanctions on Russia. We'll have a major package announced on Friday, end quote. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby also said the U.S. would be announcing a major sanctions package on Friday. Kirby said the sanctions aim to, quote, hold Russia accountable for what happened to Mr. Navalny and, quite frankly, for all of its actions over the course of this vicious and brutal war that has now raged on for 2 years, end quote. Kirby would not offer any details on the sanctions when he was asked, and it's unclear what steps the U.S. could take since it's already imposed so many sanctions on Russia. I don't know what else they could possibly do. The one thing that I mentioned is they have those frozen Russian central bank funds, $300 billion, and most of it's frozen in Europe. The U.S., I believe, has around $70 billion. So it's something they want to do is give that money to Ukraine. Now, as far as I understand, that's still kind of a long ways off. That they're working out the details, and Europe isn't on board yet. But I guess one thing maybe the U.S. could do is give the money that they have, just this 70 or so billion that they have to Ukraine. And this is as they're struggling to get that new aid passed. That would be a pretty extreme step, but I wouldn't put it past Biden. But besides that, I don't know like what they could actually do to hurt Russia anymore at this point. Articles from The Dissenter by Mohammed El-Mazi. This is Kevin Gostola's, I hope I pronounced his name right, Kevin Gostola. It's his website. He covers the Assange stuff very well, and whistleblower stuff in general. But it's kind of a summary of the hearing, the first day of Assange's appeal hearing, which was the defense. So the judges heard from the defense, and this is a good summary of it. So the defense argued the following. Number one, the U.S.-UK extradition treaty clearly prohibits extradition for political offenses. Number two, the offenses that Assange is prosecuted with, namely espionage, fall into the category of pure or self-evident political offenses. So that's something that the treaty, the extradition treaty between the U.S. and the UK prohibits, is extradition for political offenses. And they're saying that what Assange is being prosecuted for is clearly political. Number three, it was an abuse of process for the U.S. to seek the extradition for Assange for political offenses. Number four, extraditing Assange in violation of the extradition treaty would result in detention, which is arbitrary, and in violation of Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Number five, extradition would represent a flagrant denial of his right to freedom of speech. Number six, allowing Assange to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act when no other journalist or publisher ever has been violates his Article 7 right to be prosecuted for acts which do not constitute offenses at the time of his actions. Number seven, Assange would not receive a fair trial in the U.S., and I think that's pretty clear that he wouldn't. And the defense lawyers also brought up new evidence that was not as part of the final appeal. So the decision to extradite Assange was made in January 2021, which is a long time ago, and over 3 years ago. I didn't realize it's been that long. But
here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
And there it is, America. No ceasefire. We supply weapons to keep bloodying the killing fields. And what happened today? 3 strikes, you're out. That's right. For the third time, America vetoed a UN resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza. That little bullshitters, the little Blinken boy. Oh, I'm so sad of what's going on. Oh, this is the guy that goes to Israel when the war began and says, I'm a Jew, I'm Secretary of State. You're a Zionist. This has nothing to do with Jews. This is a Zionist hit. They vetoed it. They could give a fuck about the Palestinians being slaughtered. They could give a fuck that over 70% of Gaza has been blown to shit. They could give a fuck. Oh, don't believe me. Go to Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, about how the Israeli soldiers, after they bomb the shit out of there and get everybody out, stealing all the stuff. Yeah. No ceasefire. Bullshit Biden. Oh, yeah. These fucking news crap articles coming out. Biden's very upset with Netanyahu. What a bunch of crap. It's the military-industrial complex in control. Selling more weapons, stealing more of the money from the plantation workers of Slavelandia, stealing our money to keep giving it to the war machine. And we have the article in the Trends Journal this week about all the money they're making to keep the Ukraine war going and bloodying the killing fields. So we said that there's no way in the world that Russia is going to lose to Ukraine. If Hitler couldn't beat them in Operation Barbarossa, where they killed over 25 million Russians and they were the first to defeat the Germans, what the fuck do you think a lousy little country like Ukraine is going to beat them? But there's going to be a false flag attack, something hitting a nuclear plant, something major hitting Russia that's going to get them back in the news and have the people supporting the Ukraine war again because the numbers are way down. The people don't support it anymore. They came out with an article that there are more remote workers in countries around the world than in America. And we only have a 53% office occupancy rate. So you're going to see a banking collapse, the likes of which we've never seen in modern history. Nothing like it. Nothing like it. But don't worry, when all else fails, they take it to war. So what do we have here? Mortgage rates climbing, real estate collapse coming? It's a question. We answer it. No inflation? Cost of owning and operating a car keeps rising. Again, the Wall Street Journal wrote about it today. In the name of efficiency, companies fire workers. For 72 weeks, we've been putting them in the fire rings. Now, here's what's going to happen. All these people losing jobs, you're going to start seeing them losing houses too. This thing's going to get serious. It's going to go down bad, and it's not going to be very good. Again, the markets today went down a bit. You got the Magnificent Seven, big fucking tech companies. They got you're looking at some of the data we put in there from different resources, and we put the resources that we come from. They're saying that in the tech sector, you're looking at like a 46.8% PE ratio in sectors. At a good time, it's about 20 to 25 PE ratio. And now you almost double that. There's going to be a crash. I know there are people that disagree with us, but that's the way we see it happening because all things are connected. With the United States saying no ceasefire, vetoing it, the only country vetoing it in the UN, Israel's going to ramp up their attack. Again, according to the data, it's in your Trends Journal right here about Israel blowing up Iran's gas pipeline. Facts are there. So now let's imagine if if Iran bombed Israel's pipeline. Oh my God, oh, a Holocaust, oh, terrible. All right. They're going to ramp this up. Iran's going to respond. You're going to see oil prices skyrocket, and it's going to crash the global economy and the equity markets. It's on the verge because what this veto did by America has given Israel more power to ramp up their wars against Iran, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and in Syria. And the blowback is going to also come from the Houthis. They're going to do more attacks in the Red Sea. They say they're not going to stop this until, quote, a ceasefire happens. And Biden said, fuck you, no ceasefire. We supply the weapons to keep killing people, and our military-industrial complex profits from it.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Here's another article also from the Wall Street Journal on this same theme. Let's go full screen once again. The Biden team doth protest. There is no EV mandate. Dude, this has such COVID vibes to it. Now that I remember it, this one, as I read it, tell me this doesn't give you massive COVID vibes. The Biden team doth protest. There is no EV mandate. A Biden official declared, no, the Environmental Protection Agency has proposed greenhouse gas emission standards that would effectively require that EVs make up 2/3 of automaker sales by 2032. The standards will accelerate the transition to electric vehicles, EPA said. EPA's proposed emission rules are so stringent that automakers will be able to comply only by producing an increasing number of zero-emission vehicles or by buying regulatory credits from EV manufacturers like Tesla. Americans shopping for a new car will have no choice but to buy an EV or pay a fortune for the few gas-powered cars still available. And so this is what I've been talking about, by the way, of that we need to create my higher carbon reducing trees, because if we can get higher carbon reducing trees, when they have to implement products that you have to purchase the carbon credits, you got one product that doesn't work, nobody likes, but they're not using. But guess what? It doesn't matter because since it uses less electricity, you get a carbon credit for it. So it's a way of stealing that there's certain products that people actually use and like. And so the products that people actually use and like, what you do is you kind of tax them a little bit more by forcing them to spend basically to buy credits, which means that the product that you want will be more expensive. So if you want to go out and you want to buy a gas car, the company's going to have to actually buy carbon credits from people with the cars that you didn't want to buy. So now your car is going to be more expensive and some other company is going to be able to make money off of something that you didn't want or need. And so while they're doing all this, of course, they're going to go, well, there's no mandate here. We're not forcing anyone to do this. I mean, sure, we're creating incentives so that you can't make the products that people want to purchase, but force anyone. We wouldn't force anybody. All right, let's continue reading here. Yet Mr. Biden and his allies don't want voters to know that banning gas-powered cars is their endgame. That's why the progressive umbrella group Climate Power on Tuesday shot off a missive to broadcasters demanding that they pull the AFPM ads or else. These advertisements include obvious lies aimed at deceiving the public and must be pulled from the air immediately. Climate Power Chief Operating Officer Jill Schessel wrote, but who's actually trying to deceive the public? The letter cites a PolitiFact report claiming it is wrong to say that there is a Biden mandate to replace gasoline-powered cars with electric vehicles. PolitiFact is a liberal opinion operation. Was it also wrong that the New York Times last made a report that the EPA's proposed rule is designed to ramp up sales of electric vehicles while ending the use of gasoline-powered cars? But of course, there's no mandate here. No mandate here. All right, and then this was from Mishtalk. 200 economists demand the EU incorporate climate into economic models. And so this is from Mishtalk. 200 clueless and very biased economists demand more of the policies that had led to a collapse in the support of Greens all across the EU. And here was the main thing that I wanted to highlight. Their main argument is that current models favor market-based over regulation-based solutions. If that were the reason for the model's poor performance, we'd accept this argument. But again, this is not the case. The purpose of a change in model is to introduce a positive bias in favor of climate change investment, presumably because electorates are pushing in the other direction. In other words, the market and all of us, we just want to be able to consume the best goods and services at the best cost to go about our day. And the problem is that's fucking up the models. And so they want to introduce bullshit into their models that favor investment into green energy, once again falsifying government reports about what people want, what they're looking for, what the consequences are, all the data that you would need to actually digest information and make decisions. Back to the article. The letter is testimony to ongoing delusions amongst economists that they are in charge of economic policy and that their models really matter to the world. We are seeing central banks like the ECB are starting to distance themselves from those models because of chronically poor performance. All right, and I think I had one more example from the Freedom Press. I had also seen it earlier in the year. I think I might have even read it on the show. I think it was in Zero Hedge that it was published. But this is a fascinating article. It's from a person, and he works in academia, and he tells you that in order to work his career, you need to get yourself published into journals. And if you're going to get yourself published into journals, you got to make sure that the information that you're publishing actually fits their agenda. And so in this case, he's doing a study on global warming and forest fire risks. And he'll tell you straight up, if you want to prevent forest fires, why is this, give me 1 second. Everyone's coming after me. If you want to prevent forest fires, there's all sorts of things that would be more efficient than trying to change the climate. You might want to get your utility companies in order. You might want to do more forest fire prevention. There's all sorts of things that you could do that would be practical. But guess what? No one wants to read about that, and no one wants to publish it, because what people want is the information about how global warming is causing the forest fires so that they can say, hey, there's X cost to global warming. I'm putting words in this guy's mouth at this point, but that's what they want. They want to go, they're like, you're not factoring in for the cost of global warming, which is every single time that there was a forest fire, because those never existed before. And so if we forecast for the increase in forest fires because of the increase in our accounting for weather temperatures going up, well, then look at the cost of all of us actually driving our cars. All right, let's give this a read. I left out the full truth to get my climate change paper published. Let's go full screen once again. I like that. I like that. All right. If you've been reading any news about wildfires this summer from Canada to Europe to Maui, you will surely get the impression that they're mostly the result of climate change. Here's the AP. Climate change keeps making wildfires and smoke worse. Science call it the new abnormal. And PBS NewsHour. Wildfires driven by climate change are on the rise. Spain must do more to prepare, experts say. And the New York Times. How climate change turned lush Hawaii into a tinderbox. And Bloomberg. Maui fires show climate change's ugly reach. I'm a climate scientist, and while climate change is an important factor affecting wildfires over many parts of the world, it isn't close to the only factor that deserves our sole focus. So why does the press focus so intently on climate change as the root cause? Perhaps for the same reason I just did an academic paper about wildfires in Nature, one of the world's most prestigious journals. It fits a simple storyline that rewards the person telling it.
John Taylor of Caroline, the great Jeffersonian in 1814, he put it this way. He said, the present age is cajoled to tax and enslave itself by the error of believing that it taxes and enslaves future ages to enrich itself. And we can put that for taxation or running into debt. Basically, government can get away with doing all kinds of stuff, and it's okay, because somewhere down the line, someone else will figure it out. It's somebody else's problem. But I want my free stuff. I'm scared. I want the largest empire in the history of the world. I want surveillance and gun control and all the kinds of prohibition. I want welfare programs. I want all this stuff because I'm a scared little wuss and I don't believe in freedom. And someone else will pay for it. And that mentality is, well, It's either just dumb or it's absolutely cruel. But borrowing also has a limit, and the federal government has certainly pushed way beyond it. We don't know what that absolute limit may be, but sooner or later, again, things that can't go on forever don't. So enter the Federal Reserve, and they use tools like the things that we've heard of, like QE, quantitative easing, money printing, debt monetization. And let's talk a little bit more about this. And in a section that Mike, in his article, How the Fed Backstops Borrowing, he says the government borrows money by issuing treasury notes and bonds. Banks and financial institutions around the world, they buy treasuries at auctions. Have you ever had a treasury? When I was a kid, this was a big thing. You'd get this thing and they'd put it in an envelope. It'd be like a birthday present. And you know that 10 years down the line, you might get an extra $20 or it'll be worth the face value. And it was so cheap today. And you're so excited about that because you're making money. Well, this is pre-internet, I guess, or maybe I was just tricked into thinking I got something awesome. But after an allotted amount of time, 2, 10, or 30 years are very common ones, they get their money back plus interest. But because bonds are a popular investment vehicle, much of the establishment financial world, they love this stuff, maybe because they're so close as partners with the empire, with the central government. And so then they do this as a way to prop them up. Maybe that's part of it, but they also consider it a very safe investment because they assume, well, government will never, ever default. It can't ever happen here. And they are a popular investment vehicle, so the government can issue a ton of them because the establishment people, the establishment financial institutions are all about it. They think it's the most amazing thing, maybe, and they'll always throw money at it. Well, the government just issues a ton of it. But as with anything, there's also a limit on that. And bonds, Mike writes, are subject to the law of supply and demand. If the government issues too many, the price falls. And the yield, the interest rate that the government has to pay, increases. Higher interest rates mean bigger profits for investors. As rates rise, it entices more people to buy bonds. But those rising interest rates that they have to pay out for this debt, that also causes a problem for the government. They push up interest expenses means it costs Uncle Sam more and more to borrow. This theoretically puts a cap on borrowing because interest expense can rise only so high and remain sustainable. And that is really where the Federal Reserve comes in. Because when the government floods the market with bonds, and I'm sorry if this is boring, but I think it's really important stuff. I know some people tell me, dude, why do you guys cover this stuff? Well, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, and so many others, Benjamin Franklin, talked about monetary policy and banking and things like this quite a bit because they understood how it impacted government power. So let's get a little further into this. As the government floods the market with bonds, there simply isn't enough investor demand to sustain the borrowing. So the Fed eases the supply pressure. And with an operation called quantitative easing, you may have heard it called QE. I know we've all heard this term sometime over the last decade at least once. They're doing QE1, QE2. Are they doing QE? No, this doesn't count. These are the types of things that we hear conversations about in mainstream media. So with this operation called QE, the Federal Reserve creates artificial demand. So this is government manipulating the markets. They drive up prices, they drive down prices, they drive up and down interest rate, but they also create demand for government bonds. So they create artificial demand for bonds in the marketplace and hold interest rates artificially low. This allows the U.S. Treasury to issue more bonds than it otherwise could at a lower interest cost. And so how do they pay for that? Where do they get the money for that? They're just manipulating everything. And of course, that's where the money printer comes in. And of course, we all have heard people talk about how they flood the market with dollars. And now they don't have some dude sitting in the basement. What's the building? I think it's the Eccles building or something, where the Federal Reserve, the headquarters. They don't just have some dude sitting in the basement with an HP inkjet printer. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. But really, they don't use a literal printing press for this kind of thing. And Mike puts it this way. The Fed creates digital money. Much of the inflation, much of the monetary supply increase that we have today is already Federal Reserve inflated or in Federal Reserve digital money. It's just created out of thin air with digits in a computer. So they send it to the seller. They then take possession of the bonds, and then they hold the treasuries on the balance sheet. This process is called debt monetization. And the debt monetization sure sounds a lot like William Grayson described to James Madison in, I think it was a letter in 1780 or so, calling it the greatest act of despotism. And here's how he put it. For where is there a greater act of despotism than that of issuing paper to depreciate for the paying of debts on easy terms? So they're just creating additional money to pay for this debt on a low interest rate. And government is controlling this whole thing. William Grayson thought this was the greatest act of despotism. Or maybe there might be one, but he was struggling to find what that might be. Fed is literally stealing your wealth to prop up Uncle Sam's spending spree. So it's two thefts. If we're thinking about government doing stuff that they're not supposed to do. I would say, first of all, the Federal Reserve existing is a theft because it's a usurpation of power. And usurpation is an exercise of power that's not delegated. St. George Tucker called it treason against the sovereignty of the people. Sovereignty meaning final authority. If government is doing stuff that they're not supposed to do, they're actually stealing. They're stealing power that was never delegated to them, power that was reserved to the people of the several states. So that's a theft of power. And then they're stealing your purchasing power by printing the money to pay for this.
This is Koenig writes again, absurdity abounds. During comments on reports of Navalny's death, President Joe Biden called on Congress to pass that $95 billion aid package. Well, there's another reason. They needed something. Remember, it was about a week ago when the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee said, there's a national security threat from Russia, you know. We haven't heard anything about that for days now. And so this was also very convenient, the Navalny death, because it gave them yet another reason to say, we've got to pass that. You can actually put that back up if you don't mind. We've got to pass this money now. See, he's on a killing rampage. So there's another issue as well. And so this is the final quote from the Koenig that we want to put up. It looks like Navalny's death was perfectly planned. So perfectly, it sounds and looks almost naive to believe President Putin would choose such a moment in time, the Munich Security Conference, to get rid of his opposition leader. We don't know. Again, he's capable of it. But would he do such a thing? Who knows? Nevertheless, when in doubt, what do? Put on the next one, and I'll throw it over to you, Dr. Paul. Put on sanctions. Biden announces he'll impose major sanctions on Russia over Navalny's death.
There were a few stories sneaked out into the media that said these sanctions might not be working real well.
Oh, no.
So they have to reinforce all this idea, put sanctions on them. And of course, it is effective in hurting the people who put them on. Those things generally backfire. And when you're overly generous with sanctions, and you're not in the middle of a crisis like this on a politician being killed, but you do it for economic reasons and economic punishment, it's always designed, and unfortunately we have too many Republicans that like sanctions too, that this will backfire on them. And I try to get people to think about, it's your property. It's your property, it's yours. You should have the right to spend it the way you want. Well, the government takes a bunch, they spend of it. That's a good point. That's why they should take it.
There we go. So watch, Pelosi goes on unhinged rant about Trump being blackmailed by Putin. Here we go again. He's got something on him. He's doing Putin's bidding. Now go forward to that tweet, but I'm going to be able to read. Go back to the clip. Yeah, but I want to be able to read Michael Tracy. So Michael Tracy, who we know, he was in the studio here interviewing you. He's a very smart guy, in my opinion. I don't always agree with him, but he's very smart and very astute. So here's what he said about it. We're going to listen to the clip, and I'll warn our audience, please be patient. It's a longer clip than we usually play. But Michael Tracy says, amazingly, this question is asked like the Mueller report never happened, and there weren't endless, harried efforts to dig up anything that could implicate Trump financially with Russia. Down the memory hole it goes. They want everyone stuck in a perpetual 2016 propaganda vortex. So let's listen to Pelosi. I think she may be a bit past her prime, Dr. Paul. Let's listen to what she has to say.
Can't give it up.
What do you think? We're all wondering this question, Speaker Pelosi. What do you think Putin has on him? I mean, it sure seems like something, as you've said a few times, given that he refuses to criticize him, that he seems to be a fanboy of him. Are you worried at all?
During the Mueller...
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, first of all, we must be sure that he does not step one foot into the White House, not as president or not as anything. He has brought disgrace to the White House, to these presidents. I talked about George Washington. It's also President's Week for Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln died, it was embroidered in his coat that night at that theater, one country, one destiny. And he gave his life to unify our country. And now we have someone who had the honor of serving in the White House, didn't consider it an honor, didn't consider his oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution. And on this week, speaking out the way he did about Navalny shows you that he is a person without values. He looks like he's going to be a person without dollars either, but the values are what concern us.
Yes, the dollars.
So I don't know what he has on him, but I think it's probably financial. I think it's probably financial, either something financial he has on or something on the come.
So what is your reaction to that?
Everything is fear. As long as we can scare them, they'll do what she wants.
Yeah.
So that is just horrible. But I also thought, listening to, unfortunately, I heard this one before.
Oh, okay. So I didn't get to
but it was terrible to have to listen to it again.
You know what got me is that Pelosi and her ilk, they're always talking about our democracy. We got to save our democracy. Now she said, we must be sure that he does not step one foot into the White House as president. Well, who's we? What does that mean? Does that mean it doesn't matter how people vote? He won't be allowed to go in? It sounds to me like she's undermining democracy.
She and Obama.
Yeah.
But the big thing here, she's basing all this, had nothing to do with what Trump might do. What if Trump has a perfect record where they can prove, so to speak, that we would have more peace and more freedom under Trump? I mean, that's beside the point. She doesn't even care about that. She is driven by uncontrollable hate.
Yeah.
But the whole side is doing that. And they also have this belief that this has been cited, I think, by the authoritarians of the worst reputation. Just lie to them and lie to them. After a while, it will become the truth. So constant lying.
Yeah.
And she never quits.
Never
And it's
quits.
always in noble terms.
Yeah.
I mean, she's, as far as she's concerned, she sees herself as the best constitutionalist that ever went through Congress. And I keep wondering if I could look into her brain. And she said, but I had trouble finding. Now, I wonder what her brain is telling her. I really am the best.
Yeah,
Or is she brainwashed?
Yeah, yeah.
Probably doesn't matter because the people suffer from it. But it's in a way trying to understand these people. It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Now let's look at the intellectual virtues very briefly. That is to say, the virtuous use of contemplative reason. In this use of reason, we pursue knowledge for its own sake. Essentially, science, mathematics, philosophy. We discover and contemplate truth as an end in itself, without any concern for practical action or the existential consequences of that knowledge. Knowledge on this level is not a means to anything, but an end in itself. Now, for Aristotle, this life of contemplation is the highest embodiment of the life of reason. It is superior to the exercise of reason in practical affairs. It is the summit of rationality. And this is the life which any man of adequate intelligence ought to follow in his view. Now, this brings us to another error in his ethics. I don't mean his emphasis on the acquisition of knowledge, but the idea that knowledge is an end in itself, as against being a means of human action in life. Why did he commit this error? There are many reasons. Here are some. In general, no Greek, Aristotle included, grasped the relationship between knowledge and life, between reason and life. This is prior to the Industrial Revolution. And I would maintain as an actual fact that it would be impossible to grasp the relationship between reason and life philosophically prior to the Industrial Revolution. No one did, and I would say no one could have. Because at this stage of civilization, the skills needed to sustain life were manual and seemed to be obviously unintellectual. On the other hand, the knowledge which seemed pleasurable and demanding of a man's full intellectual powers, science, metaphysics, physics, mathematics, seemed to have no practical value, which it didn't at that early stage. And consequently, Aristotle, along with the rest of the Greeks, concluded that knowledge was not ultimately justified by its utility in life. This is an error, but certainly an understandable one at the stage of knowledge he was writing. Then, in addition, there is, of course, a definite element of Platonism here. The exaltation of contemplation, retirement from action in the hubbub of life, and so on, into private contemplation of truth. And, of course, we know that Aristotle never freed himself from this Platonic element, never freed himself fully in any branch of philosophy. And, of course, the prime mover is relevant here. And that, in effect, is one of the main effects of Aristotle's God on his ethics. In this life of contemplation, Aristotle says, you get as close to the divine life as you can, because that's all God does is contemplate. For these and still other reasons, Aristotle ends up advocating the contemplative life as the highest and best life. And unfortunately, he even declares that human beings are too imperfect to live this perfect life. It's not, he says, insofar as they are human that they can live thus, but only insofar as they have an element of the divine in him. In other words, he contradicts his own distinctive approach, again succumbing to a Platonic element. Now, of course, this whole doctrine of knowledge as an end in itself has had very bad consequences. It has the effect of making Aristotle's ethics impracticable for most men, restricted in this respect at least to a comparative few who have the wealth and the leisure to contemplate. Most men, however, as Aristotle recognizes, have to work, they have to act, and they have therefore neither the time, the wealth, nor the ability for this sort of life. Consequently, for them, says Aristotle, the highest form of human happiness is impossible. In this way, and in this respect, Aristotle ends up with an ethics for a comparative few, similar in this one respect to Plato.
So Israel intensified airstrikes in Rafah on Wednesday as Israeli officials are threatening to invade the city, which is packed with an estimated 1.5 million Palestinians. So Reuters reported that the Israeli bombardment in Rafah killed over a dozen members of the same family. That's the Al-Noor family in strikes on a building. And that includes a 1.5-year-old girl who was killed in the strikes. At the site of the bombed house, Palestinians were actually criticizing the U.S. for vetoing the ceasefire at the UN Security Council and just for its support of Israel in general, the U.S. support for the massacre that's happening inside Gaza. So I thought that was interesting. And this is, again, according to Reuters. They quoted someone named Yusuf Sheikh Al-Eid, who said, quote, "Since October 7th and until this moment, the U.S. has been supporting Israel with rockets, aircrafts, and tanks. All of these massacres are because of America," end quote. And I think it's important for Americans to understand, who might not think this is any of our concern, the situation that's happening in Gaza, that like many of these conflicts around the world that the U.S. is involved in, to the people being bombed, they're very much at war with the United States as well as Israel. It was the same thing in Yemen when the U.S. was backing the Saudi UAE coalition against the Houthis. If you ever read Houthi media, they always called the Saudi airstrikes U.S.-Saudi aggression is how they refer to it. So Gaza's health ministry said that a total of 118 Palestinians were killed in Gaza from February 20th to the 21st, and that includes Rafah and elsewhere. And that brings the death toll up to 29,313, with 69,333 others wounded. So a huge number of wounded Palestinians, and about 2/3 of the casualties are women and children. And again, this doesn't include the thousands of people who are missing and presumed to be under the rubble. So Israeli officials also said that they intensified operations in the nearby city of Khan Yunis, where Israeli forces are fighting Hamas on the ground. Fighting also continues up in northern Gaza, where the Israeli Defense Forces said one of its soldiers was killed on Wednesday. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz has threatened that Israel will invade Rafah by Ramadan, which begins on March 10th, if Hamas does not release the remaining Israeli captives. If Israel launches a full-scale invasion of Rafah, it'll be a massacre because of just it's just packed with people, with civilians living and sleeping on the streets. And so Gantz is saying that we'll invade if there's no hostage deal, if they don't release hostages. Right now, the prospects of a deal being reached don't look very good, although Gantz did say on Wednesday that there are early signs of possible progress. But that's just Gantz. I wouldn't give too much credit to that unless we start seeing that, from other sides. If we see Qatar saying that there's progress. So far, I'm just seeing Gantz say that. So the Israeli Knesset has overwhelmingly backed a resolution put forward by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that rejects a unilateral creation of a Palestinian state. So 99 lawmakers out of 120 in the Knesset voted in favor of the resolution. According to Ynet, Israel's Labor Party boycotted the vote, and 11 Arab lawmakers voted against it. The majority of the leading opposition parties, National Unity and Yesh Atid, voted in favor. Netanyahu celebrated the strong support for his legislation. He said, quote, "I commend the Knesset members, including those from the opposition, who today voted overwhelmingly in favor of my proposal that Israel opposes being unilaterally dictated to establish a Palestinian state. I don't recall many votes, in fact, hardly any, where the Knesset voted with a majority of 99, nearly 100 members out of 120 on any proposal," end quote. So this resolution, and we saw the Israeli cabinet, approved a declaration saying something similar. This came in response to these reports that the U.S. has been working on this peace deal with some Arab countries that they want to announce, unveil. And this is the response. This is Netanyahu's response. And this is not just Netanyahu's response, but almost the entire Israeli parliament's response. From the dissenter, another one from Mohammed El-Mazi, and I ran his story yesterday. He was covering it at the court. And so the U.S. on Wednesday, they had their, rebuttal to the Assange defense, and they just repeated things that they've repeated before. This claim that the way the leaks, really the big claim is that Julian Assange is not a journalist. He wasn't just being a journalist. He encouraged his source, to hack materials. And they claim, even though any journalist with sources will tell you that encouraging a source to give you a leak is not anything out of the ordinary. It's standard journalism, standard journalistic practice. They also recycled the claim that the WikiLeaks things that they published, again, this is going back to 2010, endangered people in other countries. And this was all dealt with when Chelsea Manning went on trial, who actually leaked the documents. And they found no evidence that anybody was killed as a result of what WikiLeaks published. So anyway, the main thing here is that they went through the 2 days of the hearing, and Assange is going to have to wait on the decision. The High Court did not issue a decision. They reserved their judgment for a later date, and it could be days or weeks before they grant or deny Assange's request for an appeal hearing. Now, this is something I didn't have right, or I didn't realize, is that this is a request for an appeal hearing. So if the court grants that request, then there's going to be the appeal actual appeal hearing. But this is, as far as his defense says, the last chance that they expect. This is the last chance. If the court denies his request for an appeal, that means extradition. I think the last resort that they have is some sort of European human rights court, but I can't see the UK, if they're determined to extradite him, really caring about that.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
This article here, Donald Trump and government theft. Let's make this clear right from the start, everybody. It's not about whether you like Trump or hate Trump. It's about what's going on against Trump. And again, to make it clear, speaking only for myself, I can't stand Trump. Don't like the cat, don't like a lot of things that he's done. The assassination of Soleimani, moving the American embassy from Jerusalem, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government, and not living up to his word on a lot of things that he said he was going to do. So I want to make that clear. I'm not a fan of his, but I call things the way they are, not the way I want them to be. I was the first magazine to call him a winner in May of 2016. Call the whole crisis about the impeachment a stupid joke, a moronic thing to do, knowing he wasn't going to get impeached because there would never be a majority enough to impeach him. About the whole Russiagate, a total scam. So I call it like it is, not what I want. And the same with the judge, and I'm not speaking for the judge, but his article here really makes it clear why they're going after Trump and what they're doing to him. And I just want to read a quick section here, Judge, and you take it away. You say, last week, a New York court ordered the Trump administration and its principals, including the former president, to forfeit nearly $400 million to the state government. This gargantuan punishment was not for any crime committed or harm caused by the defendants. Rather, it was government theft at its worst.
So Donald Trump borrowed money from Deutsche Bank regularly, consistently, and systematically. It was his, for years, sole lender, and then for other years, his principal lender. And he developed real estate in New York City and elsewhere. In order to borrow the money, he pledged assets that he already owned as security for the money, giving a mortgage. He paid back all the money that was borrowed, and he paid it back on time. The government came in and demanded his books and records and said, we think that the evaluation you put on a building that you pledged as security for a loan you made 10 years ago was not accurate, that you overvalued the building, and therefore you cheated Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank said, well, no, he didn't cheat us. We sent our own appraisers out there to appraise his buildings. We never accept at face value what our clients tell us, except in Trump's case, he was right. It was within a range acceptable to us. It wasn't exactly what we wanted, right down to the penny, but it never is, because the value of real estate can change every day. What's the value of a piece of real estate? What a willing buyer and a willing seller are willing to pay for it. And that could be different today than it was last week and will be next week. Nevertheless, the state sued him, claiming that somehow the state suffered harm because Trump over-evaluated the assets that he pledged as security for the loan, and persuaded a judge that Trump illicitly earned $160 million, and that $160 million plus interest should be forfeited to the state. Now, we have a principle of law in America called the harm principle. If I punch you in the nose, you can sue me because I have a duty not to touch your nose, and I breached that duty, and I harmed you in your nose. You can sue for pain and suffering and medical bills and loss of work and permanent injury if there is anybody. But if a friend of yours looks at the nose a week later and says, what happened to your nose? And you say, oh, the judge did it to me. Well, I'm going to sue the judge. No, that other person can't sue me because I didn't breach any duty to him. I didn't harm him. So that's effectively what happened here, except there was no nose breaking. There was no harm to the bank. The bank's executives got on the witness stand during the case and said, he paid us back every nickel we loaned him. He's one of the best clients we've had. He's the president of the United States, but if he ever goes back into this business, we'll be happy to lend him all the money he wants. And still the state persuaded a judge that somehow the state was harmed. It was a phantom harm. Now, you're an economist. You'll get a kick out of the state's claim for harm. Here's how we're harmed, the state lawyer argued. The banks loaned Trump more money than they should have. They should have loaned him less money, and therefore there would be more money in the bank for them to loan to other people, to small businesses. The bank doesn't lend from its reserves. It lends from the fake cash that the Federal Reserve gives to it. B, Deutsche Bank doesn't lend to small businesses. They don't make loans less than $100 million. C, the state doesn't know what the hell it's talking about because money is fungible. So if the bank overloaned to Trump, he didn't put the money in a shoebox. He's building skyscrapers, which is employing thousands of people, which is creating new wealth each time one of those condos in those skyscrapers is bought and sold and bought and sold. And the judge, without a jury, bought this nonsense, allowed Trump's assets to be seized from him. I'll explain the seizure to you in a minute if you want to hear it. In one of the greatest acts of theft in the modern era. I mean, this would make Joe Stalin blanch for all the farms that his communist government stole from Russian peasants, not wealthy people, peasants in the 1930s.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Can you say something then about, you have selections from the ancient world and then the medieval world and the Renaissance down to the present. But in the ancient world, which may seem, obviously it's temporally the most remote from us, but culturally and in every other way probably also seems the most remote. What do they have to say? What do some of the figures that you whose selections you include have to say to us, in some cases thousands of years later, that might be relevant?
Sure. Well, they turns out they have a lot to say. And if you just open up, this book really to any of the selections, you'll find that they're taking the world of theory and they're really tying it to a practical application, because these were gifts for very busy statesmen. And so they needed it dumbed down, so to speak, so that they could really quickly implement it. But I think the most important thing that you see going back to ancient Persia, when Xenophon is describing the education of Cyrus, you see in ancient China with Han Fei's writings, and you see it in India with Kautilya, they all start with the same thing, and that is self-control. A great leader must have self-mastery over their passions, whether that's food, drink, any addiction, any other thing. Even if it's their pride, they must have self-control. And they think it's universally, they would say it's impossible to have a great leader who doesn't have self-control. So that is a foundational principle. And I think it's, ultimately aligns quite well with the advice in the Christian world about pursuing virtue. This is something that's done, through trial and error at first. And oftentimes people don't want to become virtuous, but it does take practice. And eventually your actions and your desires will be ordered to follow your action. But you really do, from a young age, really through education, have to practice that exercise in self-control. With Cyrus the Great back in ancient Persia, kind of Xenophon paints this portrait of this amazing, conquering, heroic leader. But then as soon as he dies, everything falls to pieces, right? Everything falls to pieces. And so it's a question about, was he really a good ruler if the moment that he's gone, he never built any institutions that were capable of preserving the prosperity and the liberty that he had established? And so I think at the end of the day, the reality is you need both great leaders and good institutions that are based on principles that endure the test of time. So I think to some extent, it's a chicken and an egg thing. What comes first? Unfortunately, I think the worse that the worse that conditions get in our own regime, the harder it is to claw them back through institutional means. It's kind of like pulling the emergency brake, right? So essentially what we have is Congress is doing whatever the administrative state is kind of running on inertia, and it's doing really whatever it wants. Congress really doesn't appear to be in much control over anything. And then you have the Supreme Court, I think, pulling the emergency brake on things. But that's really no substitute for, I think, the education and the character building that's ultimately needed to raise up the leaders who could restore the republic. And I do think that task of restoring the American republic will require, strong individual leadership, in ways that I think for periods of time, might make a libertarian feel uncomfortable. But I think the aim is to restore an order where ordered liberty is preserved. You're going to have someone who's going to fight, right, the oligarchy, and that will require strong leadership.
Well, we can think of Javier Milei in Argentina as an example I think libertarians would be comfortable with. And also, I think even though he was never in the executive branch, there's no doubt that in his own way, Ron Paul exhibited a kind of leadership in that he attempted to lead by example through his congressional votes, even if he voted all alone. He did that a lot, 434 to 1, an awful lot. If it's 380, to 55, well, nobody really cares. But if it's 434 to 1, you wonder, who's that guy? It makes you wonder. And so in a very different way from, I think, the way some of these statesmen exerted leadership, he exerted it in a unique way in that he got young people to read big treatises on economics. I don't think anybody Machiavelli advised ever got to quite that level.
That is true. I do there for the libertarians, in the audience, Machiavelli does have this line. So throughout this tradition, you do see a frequent, and it's recurring. You see it in Cicero all the way to Machiavelli. Warnings about you should keep taxes low. Don't have taxes be too high, or else the people will hate you. And you're gonna quash kind of the economic engines of growth in the regime. And there's a funny line from Machiavelli, and he says, "A man will sooner forgive you if you kill his father than if you take his land." It's a little bit hyperbolic, but it kind of gets to the point of every great leader has to understand that you cannot be too overbearing with taxes. And Cicero also makes a strong defense of private property, and he's really, really skeptical of populist demagogues trying to kind of despoil the rich and redistribute the wealth. And so you can certainly find a lot of libertarian themes in many of these great classic writers.
I mean, I thought San Francisco was a nut house, and it is, but New York City sounds even crazier than that. Put on this first clip. Now, we'll start out with a tweet because I think it's a good explanation. There are two crazy things about this program. Now, City Council calls for an investigation of Mayor Adams' plan to give illegals $10,000 debit cards. The $53 million contract would give Mobility Capital Finance, who the mayor touts as minority-owned, lots of fees for services. And Ryan James Grodowski, I think he's a conservative writer, he says Mayor Adams' reason for offering $53 million no-bid contract to a company to distribute the $10,000 debit cards to migrants is because it's a minority-owned business. So you almost have a twofer here, because on the one hand, you've got the craziest of just handing people, oh, you're new to town? Here's $10,000
We stole the money, but don't worry about it.
Exactly, go ahead. And then Mayor Adams offered a no-bid contract to a company, and they're going to pocket $53 million for handing out cards. Oh, it's a minority-owned business. So you have the wokeness of the minority-owned business, and apparently they've never done anything like this before. I have a couple of clips about it. And you have the craziness of handing out this free money for everyone. And they're refillable. Like you say, if you run down a little bit, well, they'll top you back up.
Well, I think this president we have likes the idea and the principle of democracy. Yeah. But this sounds more like tyrannical management. They take the money from somebody and pass it off and buy the votes, and then they say, well, you don't have to repay it. It's a tyrant running thing. But Biden isn't the first one. It's the whole system that is like that. But he might be right now targeted because they're so blatant, and just like that minimum wage, is part of it too. Out in California, when I first heard of the minimum wage, okay, it was $253. It needs to be up to $10. I said, well, why don't you make it 15? Oh, well, that's right now. It's just a little bit too much. So right now it's up to 50. I think that even shocked the most pro. Holy man, we could get that. But it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's not a good economic policy, but it's not good moral policy. And I think it's a mixture. I think the morality of a wealth redistribution on purpose to help one group against the other one, that starts it off, and then you run into all these economic factors.
Yeah, wrong. And this came in by way of Politico. 4 myths about Ukraine that might sound wrong, might sound right, but they're actually wrong. So I messed that up. But 4 myths that they kind of sound right, but no, trust us, they're wrong. And so who are the authors? Let's put the next one up. Eric Edelman. Now, he was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in 2005 and 2009. That's during Bush. That's during the surges in Afghanistan and Iraq, the counterinsurgency war that did nothing. You remember Dr. Paul over and over again, the Fred Kagans of the world coming up to the hill saying, we're almost there, guys, just a little bit more. Well, this is the swamp. This is the soup that these guys were in. And the second guy's even worse, David Kramer. Now, he worked for John McCain. John McCain, as you know, Dr. Paul was the one who instigated the Maidan coup in Ukraine. So he started the whole thing. Now he's director of the George W. Bush Institute. I'm sure that is a beacon of intelligent thought. And he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova from 2005 to 2008. So he is steeped in the milieu of regime change in Ukraine with the ultimate goal of regime change in Russia. That's where they're coming from. Anyone who just reads their bio shouldn't read any further. Here's how the media frames it. Ukraine's withdrawal from Avdiivka is an advance towards victory. So maybe these guys are right. If losing a town brings you closer to victory, then maybe they're right.
The march is on.
The march is on, yeah. So that's number one. Skip ahead to number 2. Myth 2 is it's time for a ceasefire. This is the one that I find a little bit disgusting because these guys are very comfortable in D.C. Trust me, they've got nice houses. And these other guys that are in the trenches, it's a nightmare. But no, guys, you keep doing it. You keep staying in the trenches.
And I can't even find one of these 4 where the president might be right on.
Yeah.
He's wrong on all these
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
But so are the neocons and the
Yeah.
Republicans that push all this stuff.
Yeah.
But there is a growing group, though, in Congress right now are getting pretty tired of it
Yeah.
and not dealing at all with the borders, which is just an additional problem for us.
Yeah. Well, myth 3, and we got to go back. I'm sorry I messed up the order, but myth 3. This is almost laughable. It's a myth that Ukraine is hopelessly corrupt. How dare you? There's a myth that Ukraine is a corrupt country led by neo-Nazis. Well, if you can go to, I literally at random did a quick search before the show. Do that first. These are Breitbart too, which is a super pro-war publication. Just a couple of examples. Zelensky purges 9 top officials as Ukraine corruption allegations linger. And do the next one. New York Times wakes up to corruption in Ukraine as officials admit military contract money has vanished. So this is a right-wing Breitbart, So it's just a myth, though. It's just a myth.
Well, they would point out the election in 2019. That was cleaning up the act of our intrusion, our coup. So Poroshenko, who was supposedly an elected leader, but he was our appointee. So they have an election, and they sort of beat him pretty hard. But and then they want to argue. Well, this is an example that that it's corrupt. But that's the part. So many, we don't have to go very far to find something what is corrupt. In many ways, the whole principle of some of these elections, the way they're run, they're corrupt at core. What if it's all based on lies?
Yeah.
Isn't it corrupt? It's based on economic lies. It's based. You think these are lies, or what are they? But if some people will look at that and say, well, they're diehards, and they agree with the complaint here.
Yeah. Well, we even heard Victoria Nuland. She was on tape saying we've invested $5 billion in Ukraine. So they're picking and choosing who's running. But here, let's do the last myth though, because this is kind of again unintentionally hilarious. Myth 4: Ukraine is the wrong priority. How dare we say that? It brings us to the final myth, namely that supporting Ukraine distracts from where we should really be concentrating our efforts. Of course, China and the Middle East. But here's the funny thing. Here's their rationale. That's why this is wrong. Ukraine is the right priority, and why is that? We'll go to the next one. It's the right priority because Russia invaded a neighboring state. Russia invaded someone out of the blue. How unintentionally hilarious, because these guys served under a president who invaded Iraq based on lies completely out of the blue. So,
these people should be told, if you feel strongly about this, we as constitutionalists and libertarians, we don't want to draft you or send you to have you do or deny it, but you can pick up your rifle or do what you want. You can go over there and do it. But there's not too much of that goes on.
They're not big.
All right, let's leave the moral and intellectual virtues and turn to one last point in connection with Aristotle's ethics, namely egoism. Aristotle is a thorough egoist in ethics. He believes that each man should be primarily concerned with the attainment of his own happiness, which is to be achieved by the exercise of his own practical and theoretical reason. In contrast to Plato, there is nothing in Aristotle advocating self-sacrifice, self-abnegation, the exalting of something above your own happiness on earth. Aristotle is a pure egoist. And in contrast to the sophists, Aristotle definitely says explicitly that the true egoist is the man of reason, not the whim-worshipping brute. The sophist, for Aristotle as for Socrates, is merely engaged in expressing the worst element in himself, the part that isn't really him, his irrational whims and passions. As such, he is simply destroying his real self, his reason, and along with it, his only chance of fulfillment and happiness. In this sense, Aristotle is a consistent champion of rational egoism, the only philosopher to be such in all of philosophy, if you are talking of the major philosophers and not simply the disciples who parrot the master. Now, because this is such an urgently important issue in ethics, I want to read you a few passages from Aristotle, even at the risk of taking a couple of minutes. Don't you think you get a feeling of the philosopher from hearing a few things in his own words that you can't get from any summary? The good man, he writes, this is also from the Nicomachean Ethics, that's the ethics named after his son Nicomachus, dedicated to his son. The good man, quote, wishes for himself what is good and what seems so, and does so for his own sake, for he does it for the sake of the intellectual element in him which is thought to be the man himself. And he wishes to live and be preserved, and especially the element by virtue of which he thinks. For existence is good to the virtuous man, and each man wishes himself what is good, while no one chooses to possess the whole world if he has first to become someone else. He wishes for this only on condition of being whatever he is, and the element that thinks would seem to be the individual man, or to be so more than any other element in him. And such a man, the good man, wishes to live with himself, for he does so with pleasure, since the memories of his past acts are delightful, and his hopes for the future are good, and therefore pleasant. By contrast, wicked men seek for people with whom to spend their days, and shun themselves, for they remember many a grievous deed, and anticipate others like them, when they are by themselves, but when they are with others, they forget. And having nothing lovable in them, they have no feeling of love to themselves. Unquote. And here's another little excerpt. Quote, just a brief fragment I'll quote you. Existence is to all men a thing to be chosen and loved, and we exist by virtue of activity, i.e. by living and acting. The producer loves his handiwork, therefore, because he loves existence. Unquote. How's that? And as to self-love, quote, such a man, the rational man, would seem more than the other, the irrational man, a lover of self. At all events, he assigns to himself the things that are noblest and best, and gratifies the most authoritative element in himself, reason, and in all things obeys this. And therefore the man who loves this, reason, and gratifies it is most of all a lover of self. Therefore the good man should be a lover of self. Unquote. Now you see how this ties in with Aristotle's advocacy of pride as the crown of the virtues. It is also a majorly important element in his ethics, one that went into eclipse and was denounced by all subsequent philosophers and not resurrected until many, many centuries later. Now, I can't resist adding that Aristotle had a remarkable theory of friendship, egoistic friendship, a fascinating theory, which I love to tell you about because it exemplifies one of the best elements in his ethics, but unfortunately there is no time. But if you ask about friendship in the question period, I'll be glad to say a few words on it then. Now, to sum up our brief survey on Aristotle's ethics, you can see, I think, that Aristotle's ethics is very mixed in its merits. Much of the time, he's on the right track. Many points you can agree with. His advocacy of happiness on earth, as opposed to the Platonic asceticism and supernaturalism. His emphasis on reason, the acquisition of knowledge, egoism, pride. But these points, as you see, are embedded in a framework which is streaked with hangovers from Platonism, and which is avowedly not scientific or proven. As such, Aristotle's ethics was not strong enough to combat the Platonic and sophistic rivals in the field. And therefore, to answer a question which I get all the time, so I hope you will regard this as at least a partial answer, this is one of the major reasons, this deficiency of Aristotle's ethics, why his philosophy did not become a major influence over all future philosophizing right away. When a philosopher's ethics is weak, no matter how many good points he has in metaphysics and epistemology, his influence on men will be significantly lessened. Because men feel the influence of any philosophy primarily through its ethics. That, after all, is the primary purpose of philosophy, to teach men how to live. As an analogy, if you offer men a magnificent internal combustion machine, but they have no idea how to use it and there is no fuel to make it run, and the alternative is a horse and buggy which actually works, to say nothing of promises of a mystic flying carpet, if only they pay enough money and go to church long enough, they will choose the horse and buggy or the flying carpet over the unusable internal combustion machine, if you get my analogy. You should not be too surprised, therefore, to learn that shortly after his death, Aristotle's philosophy went into eclipse and took many, many, many centuries to exhume. But that's a story we will start telling next week.
So the Times of Israel reported this week that the $14 billion in additional military aid for Israel that President Biden is seeking was designed not just for operations in Gaza, but also to prepare Israel for a multi-front war. And they had a quote from a senior Biden administration official speaking to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency that said the $14 billion is, quote, for Israel to defend itself in a multi-front war, and to be sure it can deter a multi-front war, end quote. So Israel has been escalating airstrikes in Lebanon against Hezbollah, though many strikes have killed civilians, as we've been covering. And this is one area that risks, a full-blown war, whether it be in the form of Israel actually invading southern Lebanon or just kind of ground fighting at the border. It's already pretty heavy, the airstrikes and rocket strikes across the border. So this is something that the U.S. is preparing, wanting to help Israel prepare for with this new $14 billion in military aid. And U.S. officials have even acknowledged to the Washington Post that they fear Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu might view war in Lebanon as key to his political survival. Israel has also been attempting to provoke Iran, or at least that's what it appears that they're doing here. They've killed several members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Syria over the past few months. And according to the New York Times, there was an attack on Iranian natural gas pipelines last week. And the New York Times reported that Israel was behind that attack. So a covert attack like that inside Iran. Israel does have a history of doing that, but still, it seems like what other purpose would they have than to try to provoke Iran? And so this $14 billion for Israel is packed inside the $95 billion foreign military aid bill that was passed by the Senate, but it still hasn't gone through the House. I haven't been staying super on top of kind of the drama in Congress over this bill, so I'm not exactly sure what the chances are of it being brought to the floor of the House for a vote at this point. I know the Republicans are still trying to get some sort of border deal. If it actually was put up for a vote, it would pass, and then Biden would sign it into law, but it's just not clear when it's going to be put up for a vote. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has agreed to send negotiators for hostage deal talks with the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar in Paris on Friday after declining to participate in a previous round of talks. So the decision came after Brett McGurk, who is President Biden's top Middle East official on the National Security Council, met with Israeli officials in Israel on Thursday. According to a report from Axios, McGurk asked that Israeli negotiators be sent to Paris. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told McGurk that Israel will expand the authority to their hostage negotiators, but said that Israel is also preparing to continue intense ground operations in the Gaza Strip. So Benny Gantz, who's a minister in the Israeli War Cabinet, he's threatened that Israel will launch a full-scale assault on Rafah by the beginning of Ramadan, which is March 10th, which is pretty close. It's not very far away. He said that'll happen if Hamas doesn't release the hostages, and that deadline does not really give negotiators much time to work with here, considering it seems like they're kind of starting this new round of talks. There hasn't been much progress in the past week or so, and Rafah is going to be a bloodbath if they launch a full invasion of the city. And the deal that the Biden administration is pushing, they're still saying that they want this deal for a 6-week truce, but it's unclear if Hamas is going to go for that. They're still pushing. They've been pushing for a permanent ceasefire, or actually the proposal that they put forward, the last known proposal that they put forward was for a 135-day ceasefire. But the idea was during that time, to work out a deal for a permanent ceasefire and an Israeli withdrawal. But that, of course, was very strongly rejected by Netanyahu. The Axios report said that the main sticking point between Israel and Hamas is over the number of Palestinian prisoners Israel would release. Hamas's proposal called for the release of at least 1,500 Palestinians. According to Haaretz, Israeli officials believe that Hamas may be willing to show more flexibility regarding the number of Palestinian prisoners, but they're saying that they think Hamas still wants a total end, a total ceasefire, which is something Israel is not going to go for. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone, and U.S. officials told the Washington Post described the war in Ukraine as providing the U.S. with ample information about Russian warfighting strategies, and basically the wording that they used is they called it bountiful research. That's what Ukraine is to them. It's basically a testing ground, and we've seen this kind of rhetoric before, even from Ukrainian officials. The former defense minister Oleksiy Reznikov said, come on, send us all your weapons, talking to the Western arms makers, say we're a perfect testing ground for your weapons. So this Washington Post report said, quote, the war remains an active and bountiful research opportunity for American military planners as they look to the future. We immersed them in this conflict to make sure they were understanding the implication for warfare, end quote. So again, just the way that they are viewing this war as things are looking so bleak for the Ukrainians, with the manpower shortages, weapon shortages, and they're saying that they're outnumbered 5-1 in these battles. But it's all good for the U.S.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
The markets. Everybody's concerned about the equity markets. We don't talk about this shit. Oh, the markets went up today. The S&P surged to new highs Thursday after the chip giant NVIDIA reported much stronger than expected quality results, lifting the whole tech sector. Yeah, the Magnificent Seven. The world economy is going down. The markets are nothing more than a rigged game. And again, we said when the whole chat began in 2023, we said this is for real. It's only going to keep escalating. And again, you go back to your Trends Journal, back when it used to be a quarterly, a newsletter, .com this. Fall issue, 1999, we said the .com bust would happen by the second quarter of 2000. It didn't. It did, rather. This is different. This chat is real. Again, we have a whole section in our Trends Journal about technocracy, and Joe Duran, the technocracy guy, man, that nobody could touch. This is one of his books, Be Human. Yeah, so this is real. So, but then you have to look also what they're saying now. The guess is that they're only looking for bearish sentiment is only 31%. So it's very low. And it keeps going down week after week. But we're only looking at the United States. We're not looking at the rest of the world because that's all America does. Again, you go to everyone. You go to BBC, you go anywhere. Oh, this guy Nalvani. Every fucking day I'm hearing about this. Every fucking day. What the fuck do I care about this? How about Julian Assange? Fuck him. These are the Russians. You gotta hate them. Hey, how about fucking Guantanamo, huh? Where the Americans tortured people day in, day out, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. Fuck that. I cannot tell you how many fucking people are talking about this Nalvani shit, about his fucking wife, his mother. There's bigger issues going on. We got to stick together, and you can't do it on our own. I need your help. Our staff is working harder than anybody anywhere to put out trends information you're not getting anyplace else. So we're going to keep going on about the economy. You ready? Bad property debt outstrips reserves at big U.S. banks as late payments rise. Yep. This is according to the Financial Times. Late payments linked to offices. Oh, and shopping centers. This is all old news for Trends Journal subscribers. We've been warning about this since they started the COVID war and locked down the country and countries. You got to spell it right. Countries, because that's who locked it down. Again, it's right here. We've been warning about this. Hedge funds bet against German lender over U.S. real estate loans. Oh, wow. Yeah, German mortgage lenders become one of Europe's most bet against stocks as its battle a surge of soaring loans tied to U.S. commercial property. Go back to your Trends Journal. Office building bust. We've been warning about this for 3 years, and the banking crisis is going to come. Eurozone pay growth eases to 18 months. They're so happy that the plantation workers of Slavelandia are making less money, and scum like the ECB, and I can't say the woman running it because I don't want to be called, sexist. Like in America with the scumbag clown playing Fed head Powell and Miss Facha Brut yelling, they're blaming inflation on high wages, and boy, are they happy they're going down. The first slowdown in the figures since the second quarter of 2000 comes after the ECB policymakers said they wanted clear evidence of wage pressures moderating. Inflation wasn't caused by high wages, you fucks. It was caused by all the cheap money the scumbags flooded into the economy when they started the COVID war and your zero interest rate policy. Got it? Calm down, Salenti. Swallow the shit. Be a good little boy and girl. Have no balls. Be dried up. Don't fight. This is total bullshit. They're blaming the plantation workers of Slavelandia for inflation. And they're so happy wages are going down. Norsk Hydro hit by weak aluminum demand. Very, very important because it's showing a recession. And this is the language from Graham Keir, chief executive of South 32, a large Perth-based aluminum producer, said demand for metal in Europe was anemic. Paul Kildemo, chief financial officer of the Norwegian company, Norsk Hydro, said construction crash because of high rates and rising building costs. Again, old news. We warned this is going to happen. But hey, the stock markets are up. What's the matter with you?
Has the U.S. ever acknowledged to itself, to its own officials, among its leading officials, of which you were one, that the two-state solution is dead on arrival?
Colin Powell and a number of other people at the State Department and principals in the administrations other than state talked about it and talked about the roadmap being dead, the Middle East peace process being dead. Indeed, George Bush, if what Colin told me was correct in the debriefing in 2004, when he met with then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in the Oval Office, Bush had given him carte blanche, essentially prefacing the carte blanche with the statement that the 40 years of failed policy hadn't produced a thing. So over to you, Ariq, over to you. And Sharon, somewhat stunned by that advice, went back and it was over to him. And then, of course, later over to Netanyahu. And they've been doing it. They were doing it clandestinely, if you will, before. We certainly knew what they were doing. And we issued a demarche every now and then, or we objected every now and then, but we didn't put any real roadblocks in their way. Then they just started going whole hog. They have been doing what they're doing right now in Gaza, incrementally and slowly in the West Bank, and they had begun in East Jerusalem ever since then. They have been running the Palestinians out or killing them, confiscating their land, and beginning the settlements to the tune of now we have settlements that look somewhat like Los Angeles and the hills above it. And we have others that are very rudimentary, but going in that direction, and roads and highways and such all over the place. We have an entirely different situation in the West Bank and developing in East Jerusalem. And indeed, we have totally ignored that.
I want to show you one of the oral arguments made to the International Criminal Court. This is in behalf of the Palestinian people. It's very articulate, and it shows a series of maps starting in 1948 and going up to 2023. And I'm going to ask you at the end of this presentation, which is just about a minute and a half long, if these maps are accurate or if they're disputable.
Allow me now to show you 5 maps. The first one is historic Palestine. This is the territory over which the Palestinian people should have been able to exercise their right to self-determination. Instead, the General Assembly recommended the partition of Palestine, ignoring the will of our people as shown in the second map. With the Nakba that ensued, over 2/3 of our people were systematically and forcibly expelled by Israel. And 3/4 of Palestine became Israel, as shown in the third map. This was the start of the Nakba, the dispossession, the displacement and replacement of our people, the denial of rights and discrimination that continues to this very day. In 1967, Israel then occupied the remainder of Palestine, and from the first day of its occupation, started colonizing and annexing the land with the aim of making its occupation irreversible. It left us with a collection of disconnected Bantustans, preventing the independence of our state, as shown in map 4. Israel wanted the geography of Palestine, but not its demography. So it kept pushing our people out of their homes, out of their land. Here is the 5th map. It was displayed by Israel's Prime Minister to the General Assembly last September. He called this the new Middle East. There is no Palestine at all on this map, only Israel, comprised of all the land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This shows you what the prolonged, continuous Israeli occupation of Palestine is intended to accomplish: the complete disappearance of Palestine and the destruction of the Palestinian people.
Can this be historically challenged?
Not really. He's right. It'll be historically challenged because we have propagandists in this country who contort history to their own wishes all the time, as do other countries too. Let me give you something else he didn't talk about. When the 1967 wars occurred and Israel achieved a blitzkrieg-like victory over Arab armies, significant Arab armies, the United States changed its policy. Its policy up until that time had been to tolerate Israel as a bastion in the Cold War, an unsinkable aircraft carrier at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, we used to call it in the military. Changed its policy to be, they can keep the Arabs at bay forever if necessary. Thus, we're going to change our policy. Let me just give you an indicator of that. Up until, from 48, the initiation of the State of Israel, up until 67 wars, we gave them approximately $1 billion. From 67 to the present, we have given them $50 billion, which interpreted in constant dollars over that time period is $300 billion, or roughly about $7,000 per Israeli citizen. Considering the changes in population over time, $7,000 per every Israeli citizen. So one has to conclude from that strategically, We think Israel is doing our purposes in the Middle East. The question to ask today, I think, the huge question is, do we think what they're doing in Gaza is achieving our national security purposes? If we do, we are insane.
This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Libertarians right now, as bad as things are, and I think you've done some of the, I remember you coming on my podcast during 2020 at the height of like the lockdowns and stuff like that, and you were kind of talking about like, look, this is how bad this thing could be. And your speech at Porkfest from a few years ago was kind of a similar note. Like, look, we got to be serious about how bad this all could be. And I agree with all of that. All of that. If you zoom out and look back at what's happened in the last few years in this country, it's like, a lot of the stuff that guys like you and Ron Paul and stuff were talking about for a long time, it's like, oh, this is starting to come true. And it's kind of scary, like how dangerous this all is. So that's going on. And then at the same time, libertarians have this like enormous opportunity where, first of all, and again, I know I've mentioned this on my show several times, but your video that you made, which is, I don't know when it was back a while ago, that you made the video where you talked about if you were going to counsel the real rulers of the world, and you went through this whole thing where you were like, hey, you guys did a great job controlling the money and the education system and the military and all of this, man, you guys have just done a knock-up job, but you got a real problem on your hands because there's this internet thing. There's this social media thing. And now everybody can just spread these messages. And not only that, but they can see how everyone agrees with them. Like they can see someone being like, Hillary Clinton's a lying murderer. And oh my God, it's got 300,000 likes on this, so the big thing used to be that Ron Paul was iced out. He was blacked out of media coverage. And that's like, damn, man, if you could just get up there. And even in those debates, they'd only give him a few minutes, but in those few minutes, he'd knock it out of the park. And it was, people would get so excited. Well, now that's all over. Now we can all spread our message and to varying degrees of large audiences, including to really, really large audiences. Libertarian message is getting out there. And also at the same time, and I'm not saying there's not opportunity in the left half of America, there is. There's a lot of them who are walking away from the crazy stuff. RFK demonstrated that with how good he was doing on rejecting the COVID and regime and rejecting the war in Ukraine. But man, on the right half of America, Bob, me and you in the George W. Bush years could not have envisioned what an opportunity they're at, where you're telling me all of these people have been turned against like the warfare state and the CIA and the FBI and the NSA, and they're totally skeptical of everything the corporate press tells them. And there's just all this fertile ground. And then in that environment, you have libertarians who want to talk to them about like, yeah, look, the CIA and the Federal Reserve and all that, and they're with it on all of it. And then you go, oh, and by the way, also we have to open the borders and allow homeless junkies to shoot up on public streets. And you're like, oh, great. You just took the golden opportunity you had to actually move the needle, and you blew it for something that's not even the correct libertarian principle. Like, that's not even it. And in fact, all of these problems only exist on government property. They only exist on the government property. The private sector solves it. But how does it solve it? Not by allowing them to do heroin, not by allowing them all to flood in. It solves it by saying you can't do that here. And so why would the libertarian approach be that what the solution on private property is ought not be applied on government property? And in fact, the exact opposite is what ought to be applied there to make your life miserable and also guarantee that you will never listen to anything else I have to say. That's why I'm picking this fight. That's why I'm like driving Liberty Twitter crazy, because I think this is that important for us to like clean up this part of our message. It's not the right thing in terms of theory. It's not the right thing in terms of strategy. And it's not the right thing in terms of consequentialism, like in terms of what it's going to end up in. So that's essentially my argument.
Okay, well, I think that's well put. And again, just you even just when you elaborated there a minute ago on the bring the troops home to protect the border kind of thing, you're right. If somebody wants to say no, I think that would be a bad idea. I mean, I get that. Believe it, the federal government, as you know, anything we give them, they're going to pervert and 100% do something horrible with it. Yes. But if what you're saying is so, therefore, I think that we should keep them abroad. Well, then that's even worse. It's like, yeah, let them oppress people, not oppress, go kill people. You know what I mean? Like, if we can't trust them to be right here with all the TV cameras rolling and everything to protect borders because they're going to oppress Americans, that's like, well, surely then keeping them abroad where they're rampaging around people that, in other words, it's almost like we're getting what we deserve if it's our own soldiers doing it to us. Well, you get what I'm saying.
Not exactly. But I get your point. And I also,
it'd be better if they're, if given that they come from us and that we're paying for it and whatever, and rah, and voting for people who order them around, if then they turn the guns on us, okay, but to send them abroad to terrorize people abroad, like that's even worse. That's what I'm getting at.
It kind of reminds me of, I remember David Friedman said something along the lines of, and this was years ago, so I forgive me if I'm not getting this exactly right, but he said something. He was talking about the secession and national divorce, and he goes, "Okay, but so like, are you telling me that if there's secession, let's say like Texas secedes, and then Texas has authoritarian anti-liberty policies, that's okay? It's okay because it's a state government?" And then I think both me and you would be like, "No, then we start opposing that." Like once we get to that stage, then we start opposing that, and then we start saying, "Hey, San Antonio should secede because they're," what I mean? Like, so it's not, again, I'm not saying, "Oh, I think the federal government will do a really good job at this task," or, "Oh, there won't be other types of problems." It's like, yeah, that we should get all these troops home, and then we start opposing how they have a militarized zone or how they're what I mean? How they're violating rights there. It's not that I don't get libertarianism 101, and it's not that I trust the government. I know they're going to do a bad job no matter what they do, and there will be rights violations, and we should always be against that.
How's this? If right now we didn't have a standing army and we just had militias, you would not say, "You know what? I think it would be a good idea if the government built up this huge army and then used it to patrol the border." Of course, you're just saying, no, given that there's this sprawling army doing all this stuff, and they're saying, we just don't have the resources to protect the border right now. Like, no, that doesn't make sense. We do have the resource. That's more of what you're, okay.
100%.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Now, also in these Fed minutes, and not just the Fed minutes, but we had some other Fed officials over the course of the week who spoke publicly, and they all talk about the fact that monetary policy is restrictive and that it's been restrictive for a while. And the question is, how much longer should they stay restrictive? And there are even some FOMC members that are worried that they're going to overstay. In fact, I hear a lot of people. I was listening to Mohammed El-Arian was up on CNBC worrying about a policy error that the Fed's going to say too tight for too long, and they're not going to cut soon enough, and that's going to be their mistake. They've made a lot of mistakes, and they're going to make more, but that's not the mistake. The mistake isn't being too tight. The mistake is that they're too easy, and they're still too easy. The monetary policy that we have right now is not restrictive. I don't care that the Fed raised interest rates from 0 to 5.25, 5.5. This is not a restrictive policy. And even though the Fed continues to shrink their balance sheet, and it dropped again, we got the numbers earlier today, another 50 billion. We're getting close now to a $7.5 trillion balance sheet, so almost $1.5 million of quantitative tightening. They've actually managed to do that. A bit surprising that they've even gotten this far. They're going to give up. The question is, when. But so far, the markets are hanging in there, and so the Fed has been able to continue with this, slow bleed on quantitative tightening. But this is not a restrictive monetary policy. Again, less loose doesn't qualify as tight. But the way you know that monetary policy is not restrictive is look at the market. What is being restricted? Is the government being restricted? Is there any cutback in government spending? Is the government borrowing less because the Fed has increased the cost of borrowing money? No, the government's borrowing more. In fact, they're borrowing more to pay the higher interest rates. So they're not slowing down anything. Government spending. Look, Biden just forgave some more student loans. Where's that coming from? They passed recently some tax cuts. The government is still stimulative. So Fed policy is not restricting. You're supposed to cause cuts to government spending and borrowing. That's what restrictive is. What about individuals? Are they being restricted? No. Credit card debt is a record high. Household debt is a record high. Spending keeps increasing. Where is the restriction? There is none. The Fed is accommodating. It is accommodative to all this borrowing and spending. It is stimulative. The Fed is still providing stimulus into the economy. Maybe it's not providing as much as it was before, but it's still providing it. And with its forward guidance, it's providing it by promising to cut rates. Look at the stock market. The stock market's at record highs. Is the Fed's monetary policy restricting the stock market? No, the stock market is booming. At least, a small, section of it that's leading the averages. But you've got record highs in the stock market. This isn't a restrictive policy. And of course, to the extent that the stock market has a wealth effect, which facilitates additional consumption, additional spending. If monetary policy was restrictive, what would you expect to be observing in the real economy? Well, a decline of borrowing and spending. Stock prices would be lower if the Fed was restrictive. You'd have a reverse wealth effect, right? You'd have stock prices going down. None of this is happening. This is an accommodative Fed that is accommodating massive spending, massive borrowing. Yeah, sure, it's got a pretense. Oh, yeah, we're going to fight inflation. We've raised interest rates. Look where they were. They were at zero. And so, oh, yeah, it looks like they're high. Go back in history and look at interest rates in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, even the 2000s. The rate that we have now is not high. But we have very high inflation. We have a mountain of debt. We need much higher interest rates than what we've got. But the Fed is trying to convince everybody that 5.25 is restriction. And at the same time saying it's going to cut rates. I mean, how are you having restrictive monetary policy if you're dangling all these rate cuts in front of everybody, right? You're like waving a flag at a bull. Right? This is loosening monetary conditions. The Fed is actually easing without even cutting with its forward guidance and the expectation that, don't worry, yeah, rates are 5% now, but they're not going to stay 5% for long because we're going to start cutting, even though 5% is historically low, at least since the leaving of the gold standard. I mean, you can't compare the interest rates that we have now to interest rates we had under a gold standard because it's apples and oranges. I mean, we had real monetary discipline back then. But if you go to not just the post-war, but post-1971, ever since we went to fiat money, the rate that we have right now is low. It's not restrictive. We had restrictive monetary policy in 1980. What did that look like when the Fed was actually being restrictive? Well, rates were at 20%, and inflation, more honestly measured than it is now, peaked at 13.5%. So you had 6.5% real interest rates. The Dow was below 1,000, and gold was at 1,000. So you had a situation where the Dow and gold were the same price when the Fed was really being restrictive. You had a very severe recession, 1981, 1982. That was the worst recession since the Great Depression, right? Until I guess we got the 2007, 2008. But bond yields were 13, 14%. Right? So yes, there you had a restrictive monetary policy. What we have now is nothing like that. And the reality is, from a fiscal situation, we were far sounder in 1980 than we are in 2024. We need even tougher monetary policy than what we got from Volcker. 1980, we didn't even have $1 trillion national debt. Now we got $34 trillion and rising. 1980, I think debt to GDP was around 30, 40%, something like that. Now it's 125%. 1980, we were running large trade surpluses. We were still the world's biggest creditor nation. Now we're running huge trade deficits. We're the world's biggest debtor nation. So we need a restrictive monetary policy now more than ever, except we can't afford one because we're so broke.
Here in the Utah law, it says federal directive means, quote, a statute passed by the U.S. Congress. 2, an executive. So there's a few things. 1, a statute passed by Congress. 2, an executive order from the president. 3, a rule or regulation adopted by a federal agency. Or 4, an order or action by a federal agency, an employee or official appointed by the president of the United States. So just basically federal acts, laws, rules, orders, regulations, mandates, etc. They're just saying, hey, if we determine that any of these things violate the principles of sovereignty, of state sovereignty, then we can, if we want to, pass this concurrent resolution to say that no one in the state can help the federal government enforce it. And they say a federal directive, this is the standard that they're going to use. A federal directive violates the principles of state sovereignty if the federal directive restricts or infringes upon a power or right reserved to the state by the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution, or the state's rights or interests to provide for the health, safety, and welfare and promote the prosperity of the state's inhabitants. So in their view, if they determine that a federal program, a federal act, a rule, a regulation, executive order violates these principles, this line in the sand, it's a very gray area. It's up to them how they determine it. They can then pass this concurrent resolution and no one in the state can help the federal government enforce it. And they also specifically say just because we don't act on something, this was pretty smart, just because we don't act on something doesn't mean we're implying that the federal act doesn't violate the principles of state sovereignty. Now, it should be pointed out that they did not need to pass this. They didn't have to pass it at all because they already have the power to do this. It's a reserved power to determine how to use their own resources. This is called the police powers. James Madison described it in Federalist 45. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government would be few and defined. Those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. And that's the broad swath of what they call the police powers. They can do basically whatever the people of each state determine that they want to allow their state to do or not to do. So they already have this power to determine how they're going to use or not use their own personnel and resources. And they don't have to help the federal government. If the federal government needs help from the states to implement their acts, they've got a different problem. Maybe they're doing too much stuff in the first place, and they're relying on the states to do the work that they want to get done. And that's how kind of they get away with doing a lot of extra stuff, is that they hand out a lot of cash to the states, and they hand out goodies, and they say, partner with us, and you do all this stuff for us, and they can get away with implementing a lot more stuff. Now, Alexander Hamilton had a little something to say about this type of a process, whether you rely on the states or not. He hated the idea under the Articles of Confederation that many things required a positive action by the states in order to implement it. In Federalist 46, or Federalist 16, I'll get to 46 and Madison in a moment, he said, if the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated. Now, of course, he was complaining about that type of situation under the Articles of Confederation, and Congress couldn't get a lot of the stuff done that he had been pushing for them to get done for some time. But the important point remains, and Hamilton was absolutely correct here. If the feds need help from the states, then the states can just say, hey, we don't want to help you. They just choose to not do anything, or they act evasively, and they defeat the federal program. Now, even the Supreme Court, now if we're talking about what the founders have to say, a lot of times modern precedent and practice, it totally ignores them. Very rarely do you find something in modern Supreme Court precedent, especially something that lasts over 150 years, case after case after case, they take the same position, which supports people like James Madison and Roger Sherman in saying that the states should just not help enforce, should not participate, use a refusal to cooperate, and that's okay. And this is called the anti-commandeering doctrine. It goes all the way back to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1973 case in 1842, Prigg versus Pennsylvania. The most prominent, basically it says that the Supreme Court has held over and over and over from 1842 through 2018 in a bunch of major cases that the federal government cannot require the states to do anything to implement or enforce federal acts or regulatory programs. The most prominent one that most people would know if they're mentioned this, lawyers tend to ignore it. If they don't, they're like, oh, dude, what was that? I know I should remember this from law school, but they'll be reminded in time as we keep pushing forward with this. Here's 1997, Prince versus U.S. The federal government may neither issue directives requiring states to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. It matters not whether policymaking is involved and no case-by-case weighing of the burdens or benefits is necessary. Such commands are fundamentally incompatible with our constitutional system of dual sovereignty. There's no dual sovereignty. The only sovereignty is with the people of the several states, but we'll skip over that for now. But basically, the federal government cannot direct the states to help them do anything. There is no such thing. Now, the most recent one was in 2018, Murphy versus NCAA. And here's just a quick clip from it. The anti-commandeering doctrine may sound arcane, but it is simply the expression of a fundamental structural decision incorporated into the Constitution. The decision to withhold from Congress the power to issue orders directly to the states. It is not there. The government is one of delegated and reserved powers, and there is no power delegated to the federal government to order the states around. The third Chief Justice, Oliver Ellsworth, said, this Constitution does not attempt to coerce the states in their political capacity. They cannot use this type of force to tell them to do stuff. Now let's get to CNN. I know you've been waiting. We can't even get past the title before it's absolutely stupid. Utah's new Sovereignty Act sets up a process to overrule the federal government. But is it constitutional? I mean, if you listen to what I just had to say here and you read the text of the bill, I only read you parts of it, there is nothing in there about overruling the federal government. It's not saying that the federal government's laws are not valid. It's not telling the federal government that they can't come in and do what they do. They're just saying, we're not going to help you. It says nothing about overruling anything. But here in the lead, the first paragraph, a bill recently signed into law in Utah sets up a process for the state to overrule or otherwise ignore federal rules and decisions, the latest move in a Republican-led push against what they see as federal overreach. Again, the legislation, the law says absolutely nothing about overruling anything. It is literally just a process by which the legislature year-round can have this concurrent resolution and say, we're not going to help the federal government. It's not about ignoring them. The federal government does not have the authority, as we can see, even the Supreme Court tells us. They can't tell the states they have to help them enforce federal acts. It's got nothing to do with anything that CNN is saying. If you can't see the difference between, we're not helping versus we're overruling, you're probably just being dishonest, and maybe the CNN article is awesome for you now. Also, Fox News. The local Fox affiliate, Ben Winslow, says Governor Spencer Cox signed a bill into law that allows the state to ignore some federal directives and orders. There's no such thing that the federal government is directing or ordering the state of Utah to do. And they're not allowed to do that. Now, the state of Utah can agree to go along with stuff, but they're not required to participate in enforcing federal acts or regulatory programs. All right, here's a juicy one. The Salt Lake Tribune editorial board says Utah leaders want to fight the Civil War over again. it won't end well, because just not participating in enforcing a federal program or just saying we are going to consider this at some point in the future means this is civil war. They hate the idea of anyone not going along with centralized power and control.
This whole thing about the people coming in, I think the word is invasion. You know, what do you mean invasion? They don't have any guns, but they don't have to. Our guards just laid their guns down and said, come on in. We have no rules. We do whatever you want. And we'll pay your way. We'll provide homes, even if we have to take it from hardworking Americans. So they did that. And I'm convinced anytime you subsidize something, make it easy to become a citizen or bribe them to become a citizen, you're going to get a heck of a lot more of it. And it's been at the expense of the American people. But I think that problem comes from the fact of a careless attitude about what property is all about. Because if you think of immigration as something, how do we deal with immigration invaders into our own home? I don't think there are many Americans, rich, poor, middle class, who say, yeah, I have a house here, but I think we could squeeze 2 more people in here. So we're going to invite a couple in to stay. And if the government sends them, that's okay too. So they go along with that, but before you know it, you have something that's turned into an invasion. And literally, when you think of the people that are here, when it has to do with our civil liberties, our defense of our country, and all that's going on, it has been an invasion. And you can't invade a person's house. You know, the Bastiat principle is if you and I can't do it, and you can't march into your neighbor's house or send your friends into your neighbor's house, the government can't do it either. But the government now, you know, not to everybody's house yet, but that's what communism is all about. What they do is they put it into public arena. The public will take care of them. So who paid for the public? Well, the citizens that have been here. They're the ones who built the hospitals and the roads and everything else. So it was all, it is property, but it's collective. When it's collective, governments generally can do whatever they want. But if it were more private property, you know, I think in a theoretical all libertarian society and all the land was owned from people, you wouldn't have any problem with immigration. I think it would be generous, but it would be very deliberate. You would not be allowed to just bring anybody in and put them on somebody else's property. So I think there's a big issue of property with this runaway immigration that's going on, and it would be helpful if people thought more of that in those terms.
We've never had a perfect government, and we never will. It surely was better when it came to immigration. Both sides of my family came from other countries, and it was tough to get in here. They had to have sponsors. They had to have jobs. You know, somebody had to account for them. No one else was going to pick up the bill for them. So yeah, he's staying with me. He's working for me. His family's coming. They're all taken care of. Now we have, you know, our great society from LBJ, massive, massive welfare state, perhaps the biggest in the entire world. And now the taxpayer just picks up the bills. Dr. Paul and Daniel did a show yesterday. We're in New York City. They're handing out $10,000 refillable debit cards. So they're bringing all these people in and sticking us with the bill. I mean, this is the craziest thing one could ever imagine, but it's actually happening in real life. And the welfare state, it increases the burden on us. It incentivizes more people to come in and incentivizes them not to work. Why bother? Why work? Government's giving us money. It also, on the other side, incentivizes Americans not to be charitable. Why be charitable? Let the government take care of these people. It's such a warped welfare state system that is getting us from every angle, and it's also going to spiral us into, we're already in terrible financial shape as it is. Now it's going to get even worse, on top of this conflict of cultures. So they are setting up a perfect storm of problems. And like you said, Dr. Paul, what are their motivations for this? And obviously, I don't know. I only go by what they say, and we can clearly see that they want this surveillance state on us. This artificial climate religion imposed on us, the woke culture where there is no truth other than what the government says. Fauci said, I am the science over in during COVID with New Zealand, Ardern. She said, we are the source of truth. So everybody's supposed to walk around with no truth other than what they say. And of course, they lie about everything. So they want to impose this, but it's very tough to impose it on a unified country. And if there's enough unity, you know, we have a lot of people on the left, but there is enough unity to fight off their bad ideas. You know, most people don't believe the climate religion or the wokeism or, you know, and don't want to be surveilled. So how do you break a population like that? Well, one way is to flood a bunch of people that are, you know, different culturally, beliefs, and already on welfare, dependent on the government, voting for these people. That's one way to break the unity. If you have conflicting cultures and financial ruin, which we're racing towards, that opens the door for tyranny if that were to happen in this country. Because then the strongman comes in and say, this is chaos. I am going to restore law and order with an iron fist. I will fix these clashing cultures because everyone is going to say or do what I say. So we are opening the door for that madman if we continue down this road. So, again, this is all speculation, but, I'm trying to connect the dots just like everyone else. We have to be vigilant in speaking out, especially with this open border situation.
Think of this agony that Assange is going through, and that's an attitude. Silence the people, and that, if that has to be dealt with, might be put at the top of the list. I know how important the Second Amendment is and all the other amendments, but I tell you what, you have to have the right to speak out with a free will without being threatened by being put in jail. I think there's a lot of people already who haven't spoken out because they're intimidated, because I feel it myself at times. I wonder if I should have said that. What if I should have said that? That is criminal. That's why the real goal has to be to protect our right to speak out and make sure that these groups of special interests, whether they're the corporate interests or the government interests, that we don't continue to move in that direction. Protecting our liberties was the number one reason why we had a revolution and a constitution. And we need to dedicate ourselves to the preservation of those principles. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Please give Aristotle's views on friendship. Oh, fine. I just happen to have a little booklet here. Get it out. Now, I'll give you just a brief summary. I wanted to put this in, but I just couldn't squeeze it in. Friendship, in the Greek view, was any mutual attraction or relation between two human beings. It was wider than our present use. Aristotle defines three types of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics. One, the friendships of utility. These are what we would call business relationships, commercial relationships. In this case, there are certain practical advantages that you want from the other person, and he wants from you. You don't love the person for himself, but you want certain advantages from your relationship. And that's the lowest type of friendship. It's perfectly reputable, but it's not very much. Then comes what he calls the friendships of pleasure. This is in effect what we would call a social relationship, in the sense that you delight in the social pleasure that you get from this particular person. He's convivial, amusing, witty, funny, nice to go to the movies with, has a sparkling personality, etc. Now at this point, you have a good time with your friend, but you still don't love the person for himself, but for the amusement. This essentially is the kind of relationship that children have when they have friends, or that not fully formed adults have. And this type of friendship, says Aristotle, is comparatively easily dissolved if and when ineffective condense. The person runs out of jokes, you see. He doesn't say that, but that's the idea. Then there is finally the friendships of the good. In this case, you love the person for himself because of his character, the values he represents. He represents all the things that you think are good, and you admire him, and you mutually help each other to live the good life. Now, I stress that Aristotle is not a Kantian. He did not think that gaining practical advantages from such a friendship corrupts it. He did not think that gaining pleasure from such a friendship corrupts it. He is not a Kantian who thinks that to be a true friend you should be completely selfless and get nothing practical or pleasurable out of it. So there is utility and there is pleasure in this type of friendship. But the essence of it, and it's the supremely important type of friendship, is mutual moral admiration on a profound level between two human beings who are equal morally. Now Aristotle draws many fascinating conclusions, fascinating in the light of the Christianity that is to come, by virtue of their diametric opposition. It's almost as though he read the Sermon on the Mount and went out of his way to say what he thought of it. For instance, he stresses that you cannot expect to have many friends like this. You cannot say, I love everyone. I'm friends of mankind as a whole. You must have standards. You must know the person intimately. You don't love your neighbor as such. Friendship is a response, or love as we would say today, is a response to values and virtues in the individual. And he says this implies a certain equality between the two. A superior cannot feel friendship for an inferior, and vice versa. And he says, you owe more to your friends than you do to strangers. Of course, the exact opposite of the view that you should love your enemies particularly. Now, you know there's a certain type of modern Christian called a utilitarian who says that the proper way to act is the greatest happiness, the greatest number. So that, for instance, if you see, and this is the typical example that utilitarians give, a building on your left burning which has two strangers in it, and a burning on your right, building on your right burning which has your wife in it, you should save the two strangers because there's twice as many as in the other one. Now, of course, Aristotle would reject that emphatically. You should save your friend because you owe him more. He matters more to you rationally than the two strangers. And he says, since you love the man because he's good, if and when he turns bad, you dissolve the friendship. You do not forgive in any all-embracing Christian way. It's not judge not that ye be judged. It's judge and be prepared to be judged. And if the one or the other defaults, then the basis of the relationship is gone. Now he goes on to ask, can you be friendly with yourself in this sense? And he says, yes, if you're a good man. He says a friend is one who admires a person for his character, who wishes what is for the welfare of that person, for that person's sake, who lives with that person, who has the same tastes, the same likes, the same dislikes, who grieves and rejoices along with the person. Now, says Aristotle, all of this is most true of the good man's relationship to himself. He admires himself. Remember the great-souled man. He works for his own welfare, his own happiness. He has the same likes as himself and dislikes, and there, of course, he means to contrast him with the inconsistent villains who do something and feel guilty about it, or want something and feel frightened of it, etc., who are inconsistent with himself. When this kind of man, therefore, has complete friendship with himself, which is another way of saying he regards himself as the supreme value. When he does something for a friend, it is not a sacrifice. He is selfish because he is still gaining the greatest benefit for himself. He is defending his values, doing the good, being rational, and it is to his own ultimate happiness. Friendship, he concludes, is based on self-love. You cannot admire goodness in others unless it's present in yourself. And if it's present in yourself, the first person you should admire is yourself. That's a brief taste of what is a very excellent, in essentials, doctrine.